The silence was the first thing he stole, before him. The penthouse had been a place of quiet luxury, filled with the soft rustle of turning pages and the distant hum of the city below. After his arrival, it became a tomb, a gilded cage where the air was thick with things unsaid. His name was Killian, but he was more of a shadow than a man. He moved through the sprawling, sunlit apartment without a sound, a ghost in tactical gear whose only purpose was to orbit Seraphina Hayes. He was her protector. The solution to the credible threats the Moretti crime family had made against her father, the powerful Senator Hayes. At least, that was the official story. Seraphina knew the official story was a lie. It wasn't a fact she could prove, but a truth she felt deep in her bones, a cold dread that coiled in her stomach whenever he entered a room. He never spoke unless spoken to, and his answers were clipped, precise, and devoid of emotion. His eyes, the color of wet stone, didn't watch over her with concern. They observed her with a chilling, analytical detachment, as if memorizing weaknesses she didn't know she had. Protection was supposed to feel safe. This felt like surveillance. She would test him in small ways, leaving a book slightly out of place on a shelf or shifting a vase a few inches to the left. Hours later, she would find them moved back to their exact original positions. These were not the actions of a bodyguard. They were the actions of a jailer, a man obsessed with control. He was the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered, and he lived in her home. She was told he was there to shield her from the monsters lurking outside her door. But as the days bled into weeks, Seraphina became certain that the official story had it all wrong. The real monster wasn't trying to get in. He was already inside. Part 1. The Shadow's Arrival. Chapter 1. Seraphina. My life was a symphony of order. A carefully composed piece played out in the hushed, hallowed halls of Georgetown and the sterile, elegant quiet of our Capitol Hill townhouse. It was a life of predictable cadences, the soft click of my laptop keys as I researched legislative precedents, the respectful murmur of my father's aides, the distant, reassuring chime of the grandfather clock in the foyer marking the steady, reliable passage of time. I was Seraphina Hayes, daughter of Senator Thomas Hayes, and the world, as I knew it, made sense. It was a world of clean lines, of right and wrong, of black and white. My father was a man of unshakable principles, a crusader against the corruption that festered in the city's dark underbelly. His latest target was the Moretti crime family, a dynasty of shadows that had its tendrils wrapped around the city's shipping, its unions, its very soul. He spoke of them with a cold, righteous fury, his voice a clarion call for justice in a world gone gray. I admired him with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that was the very bedrock of my existence. He was my hero, the fixed point in my well-ordered universe. The first discordant note in that symphony was a whisper, a file left open on his mahogany desk, a name Silvio Moretti written in stark, black ink, a photograph of a man with eyes as dead and cold as a winter sea. Then came the hushed, late-night phone calls, my father's voice dropping to a low, tense murmur that I wasn't meant to hear. The security detail, always a quiet, professional presence, became a little more visible, their gazes a little more sharp. The crescendo of chaos arrived on a Tuesday, delivered in a simple, cream-colored envelope. There was no return address. Inside, on a single sheet of heavy, expensive paper, was a photograph. It was of me, taken from a distance, walking across campus, My hair caught in the wind, a smile on my face. It was an innocent, beautiful photograph, except for the single, bloody red line that had been drawn across my throat. Beneath it, 3 words were written in a neat, elegant script. She is beautiful. That night, my father's world of principles and order shattered. He looked at me, his face a mask of a terror so profound it stole the breath from my lungs. The crusader was gone. In his place was just a man, a father, who was afraid. "We're getting you a new detail," he said, his voice a raw, ragged thing. "The best. Someone from outside the usual channels. Someone absolute." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and cold. Absolute. It was a word that did not belong in my world of nuance and debate. It was a word of finality, a word of endings. The next day, the shadow arrived. His name, they told me, was Killian Black. He did not arrive with a team. He did not arrive with a flourish of sirens or a show of force. He simply appeared. One moment, I was standing in the foyer with my father. The next, the door was open, and he was there. A dark, silent void that seemed to suck the very light and air from the room. He was a giant, built not with the bulky, obvious muscle of a bodyguard, but with the lean, lethal grace of a predator. He was dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored black suit. His stillness a more potent threat than any weapon, but it was his face, his eyes, that stopped my heart. He had a face of harsh, beautiful angles, a strong, uncompromising jaw, and a mouth that looked as if it had never known how to smile. His eyes were the color of a storm-tossed sea, a deep, turbulent gray-green, and they were utterly, chillingly empty. They swept over me, a cold, clinical assessment that stripped me bare, that saw not a person, but a problem, a package, a liability. "Mr. Black," my father said, his voice strained. "This is my daughter, Seraphina." The shadow's gaze met mine. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a greeting. He simply nodded, a short, sharp, and utterly dismissive gesture. And in the cold, dead depths of his eyes, I saw not a protector. I saw a cage. And I knew, with a sudden, soul-crushing certainty, that my well-ordered life, the beautiful, predictable symphony I had taken for granted, was over. Chapter 2, Killian. The girl was a variable, a soft, fragile, and utterly predictable complication in a cold, hard equation. Her name was Seraphina Hayes, and she was the key. My mission, as dictated by Silvio Moretti, was simple, elegant in its brutality. I was to become her shadow, her guardian angel, her personal, walking, breathing fortress. I was to protect her from every threat, real or imagined, and in doing so, I was to become her confessor, her confidant, her closest, most trusted ally. I was to learn her secrets, her fears, her weaknesses, and through her, I was to find the one thing Silvio needed to break her father, the one unforgivable sin that every man, even a righteous crusader like Senator Thomas Hayes, kept buried in the dark, silent tomb of his past. The mission was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, Silvio's specialty. It was not a mission of bullets and blood. It was a mission of trust, of intimacy, of a slow, patient, and utterly devastating betrayal. I had been in the city for a week, a ghost in the shadows, studying my target. I knew her schedule, her habits, the names of her few, carefully selected friends. I knew she was brilliant, a top student in political theory, a fact that was a small, ironic amusement. I knew she was beautiful, with the kind of classic, understated elegance that was a currency in this city of power and ambition. I knew she was loved, fiercely and protectively, by her father. And that love, that pure, powerful, and utterly predictable emotion, was his greatest weakness, the photograph, the threat. It was my opening move, a simple, elegant gambit designed to create the fear, the desperation, that would allow me to be inserted into their lives. It was a lie. Of course, the only threat to Seraphina Hayes, the only real danger she was in, was me. I stood in the foyer of their townhouse, a Trojan horse in a bespoke suit, and I assessed her. She was taller than I expected, with a slender, willowy grace. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pulled back in a simple, elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was a perfect, heart-shaped oval, her eyes a startling, intelligent blue, and in those eyes, I saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else, a spark of defiance, a quiet, stubborn strength. She did not look at me with the wide, trusting eyes of a protected princess. She looked at me with the wary, assessing gaze of an opponent. Interesting. The senator, a man whose public face was one of iron conviction, was a mess of a raw, paternal terror. He explained the terms of my employment, his voice a low, desperate thing. I was to have absolute authority over his daughter's security. No questions, no arguments. My word was law. I listened. My face a mask of cold, professional indifference. But inside, my mind was already working, calculating, planning. The first step was isolation. I would cut her off from her world, from her friends, from the comfortable, predictable rhythms of her life. I would shrink her world until the only person in it, the only person she could turn to, the only person she could trust, was me. I followed her up the sweeping, elegant staircase to her suite of rooms on the second floor. It was a space that was a perfect reflection of her elegant, ordered, and filled with books. She turned to face me in the center of the room, her arms crossed over her chest. Her chin lifted in a gesture of a defiance that was as fragile as it was beautiful. "My father may have hired you." "Mr. Black," she said, her voice a cool, clear, and surprisingly steady thing. "But let me be clear. I am not a child. I will not be treated like a prisoner in my own home." I let the silence stretch between us, a cold, heavy thing. I let her see the absolute, unwavering emptiness in my eyes. "You are not my prisoner, Ms. Hayes," I said, my voice a low, quiet rumble. "You are my assignment, and I do not fail my assignments." I took a step closer, my shadow falling over her, and I watched, with a cold, detached satisfaction, as the first, faint cracks appeared in her beautiful, defiant armor. The game had begun, and I, as always, intended to win. Chapter 3: Seraphina. The world I knew ceased to exist the moment Killian Black stepped over the threshold of our home. It was not a sudden, violent death. It was a slow, quiet, and utterly suffocating strangulation. My life, once a thing of freedom and choice, was now a meticulously curated and constantly monitored existence, a beautiful, elegant, and utterly inescapable prison. He was a ghost, a shadow, a silent, ever-present specter. He moved through our home with a quiet, unnerving grace, his presence a constant, low-grade hum of a danger beneath the surface of our quiet, ordered lives. He was my keeper, my warden, My own personal, walking, breathing panopticon, and he was a master of his craft. My friends were the first to go. My weekly study group, my weekend coffee dates, the simple, easy camaraderie of my academic life, it was all deemed an unacceptable security risk. My calls were monitored, my emails screened. My world, once a sprawling, vibrant city of intellectual and social engagement, was now a small, claustrophobic island of one. Me. My apartment, my sanctuary, was now his command center. He had his own suite of rooms across the hall, but he was always there, a dark, silent figure in a corner of my living room. His eyes, those cold, stormy, and utterly unreadable eyes, always on me. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not offer comfort or reassurance. He simply watched. I tried to fight him in the first few days. I raged. I argued. I pleaded with my father. But my father, the strong, principled man I had always known, was now a stranger, his face a mask of a fear and a grim, unwavering resolve. "It is for your own good, Sarah," he would say, his voice a hollow, distant thing. "You must trust Mr. Black. Trust him, I would sooner trust a wolf to guard a flock of sheep." So, I changed my tactics. I turned to a different kind of warfare, a silent, subtle battle of wills. I would ignore him, pretend he was a piece of furniture, a shadow on the wall. I would lose myself in my books, in my research, my mind a fortress he could not breach. But he was a patient, relentless opponent. He did not need to speak to assert his dominance, his stillness, his silence. His very presence was a weapon. He would stand for hours, a silent, unmoving statue in the corner of my vision, and I would feel his gaze on me, a physical weight, a constant, unnerving pressure. He was a puzzle, a paradox, a man of 1,000 contradictions. He was a creature of a brutal, almost savage grace, yet he had the hands of a scholar. Long, elegant fingers that looked as if they could coax a beautiful, heartbreaking melody from a piano. He was a man of a few, clipped, and utterly emotionless words. Yet his eyes, those cold, empty eyes, sometimes held a flicker of something else, a deep, ancient, and utterly profound sadness. One night, I woke from a nightmare, a scream trapped in my throat, the photograph, the red line across my neck. It had been a recurring, terrifying visitor in my dreams. I sat up in bed, my heart a frantic, panicked drum against my ribs, my body slick with a cold, terrified sweat, and he was there, standing in the doorway of my bedroom, a dark, silent silhouette against the dim light of the hall. He had not made a sound, but I knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that he had been there for some time, watching me. I expected a cold, clinical response, a simple, dismissive, "Go back to sleep." But instead, he walked into the room, and he sat in the armchair in the corner, his presence a silent, solid, and strangely comforting weight in the darkness. He did not speak, he did not move, he simply sat there, a silent, solitary guardian in the heart of my nightmare. And as I lay there, my heart slowly, gradually, returning to its normal rhythm, I realized, with a new, terrifying, and utterly confusing clarity, that the man I was most afraid of, the shadow that had stolen my life, was now the only thing that made me feel safe. Chapter 4, Killian. She was breaking. I could see it in the fine, almost invisible cracks in her carefully constructed composure, in the faint, dark circles beneath her beautiful, intelligent eyes. in the way her hands, those long, elegant, and surprisingly steady hands, sometimes trembled when she thought I wasn't looking. The isolation, the constant, unnerving pressure of my presence. It was working. She was a beautiful, intricate, and utterly fascinating watch. And I was slowly, patiently, and expertly dismantling it, piece by piece. The nightmare was a gift, a perfect, unexpected opportunity. I had been in my own room, the silence of the house, a familiar, comfortable thing, when I heard it. A small, choked, and utterly terrified sound. I was in her doorway in a matter of seconds, a silent, invisible ghost. She was a mess of tangled sheets and a wild, panicked fear. Her face was pale, her breathing a series of short, ragged gasps. She was beautiful, even in her terror, especially in her terror. The mission dictated that I should remain detached, a cold, clinical observer. But as I stood there, watching her, something else, something old and dark and long buried, stirred within me. It was not pity. It was not sympathy. It was a raw, primal, and utterly possessive instinct. An urge to not just protect her, but to own her fear, to consume it, to make it a part of me. I sat in the armchair, a silent, patient hunter, and I watched her. I watched as her fear slowly, gradually subsided, as the frantic, panicked rhythm of her breathing evened out, as the tension in her body eased, and in the quiet, intimate darkness of her bedroom, I felt a new, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating sense of power. I was not just her guard. I was not just her warden. I was her anchor in the storm, her only source of a safety in a world of a fear I had created. The next morning, the dynamic between us had shifted. The cold, silent war was over. In its place was a new, fragile, and utterly confusing truce. She no longer ignored me. She spoke to me, her voice a quiet, hesitant thing, her questions a cautious, tentative exploration of the silent, enigmatic man who had become the center of her small, circumscribed world. It was a dangerous, seductive dance. She would ask me a question, a simple, innocuous thing about my day, about the city, about a book she was reading, and I would answer, my voice a low, careful, and utterly controlled thing, giving her just enough, a small, carefully selected morsel of myself, to keep her hungry, to keep her coming back for more. I was a spider, and she was a beautiful, intelligent, and utterly captivating fly. And she was slowly, willingly, and beautifully walking into my web. It was a game of a patience, of a subtlety, of a slow, meticulous, and utterly devastating seduction. And I was a master of the game. But sometimes, in the quiet, unguarded moments, in the dead of the night when the city was asleep and the only sound was the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing from the room across the hall, I would find myself wondering, with a new, strange, and utterly unsettling clarity, who was truly the spider and who was the fly? She was getting under my skin, this beautiful, intelligent, and stubbornly defiant girl. She was a dissonant, beautiful, and utterly addictive note in the cold, silent symphony of my life, and I knew, with a cold, hard, and utterly terrifying certainty, that she was a complication I had not anticipated, a variable that had the power to not just disrupt my mission, but to destroy me. Part 2, The Gilded Cage. Chapter 5, Seraphina. My home was no longer a home. It had been transformed, almost overnight, into a high-tech fortress, a beautiful, sterile prison of which I was the sole, solitary inmate. The familiar comfort of its quiet elegance had been replaced by the cold, invisible hum of state-of-the-art security systems, the whisper of encrypted communication, and the constant, unnerving presence of the man who was both my protector and my jailer. Killian Black. The first week was a systematic dismantling of my life. My world, once a vibrant tapestry of academic pursuits, intellectual debates, and the easy camaraderie of friendship, was unraveled, thread by thread, until all that was left was a small, gray, and utterly desolate square. My study group was the first casualty. Too many variables, Kyle had said, his voice a flat, non-negotiable thing. The library is a public space, unsecurable. My protests, my reasoned arguments about academic necessity, were met with a blank, unyielding wall of silence. My weekly coffee dates with my best friend, Chloe, were next. A predictable routine is a vulnerability, he stated, his stormy gray-green eyes holding mine with an unnerving intensity. We eliminate vulnerabilities. Chloe's increasingly frantic texts went unanswered. My phone now a beautiful, useless brick on my nightstand, its communications routed through a secure, monitored line that he controlled. My world, once the sprawling, beautiful campus of Georgetown and the vibrant, pulsing heart of Washington, D.C., now consisted of the four walls of our Capitol Hill townhouse. My freedom had been amputated, a limb I hadn't even realized I possessed until it was gone, leaving behind a phantom ache of a life I could no longer live. I was a ghost in my own home, a prisoner in a gilded cage, and Cale was my warden. He was a master of a silent, psychological warfare. He did not need to raise his voice or issue threats. His very presence was a weapon, a constant, unnerving pressure that was slowly, methodically, grinding me down. He was a shadow that followed me from room to room, a dark, silent figure who was always there, in the corner of my vision. His stillness a more potent threat than any overt act of aggression. I tried to fight back, to carve out some small, private space for myself in this new, suffocating reality. I retreated into the world of books, my mind a fortress I was determined to keep him out of. I would spend hours in the library, the scent of old paper and leather a small, comforting reminder of the life I had lost. My eyes fixed on the pages, my posture a rigid, defensive line. But even there, he would be present, a silent, unmoving statue by the door, his gaze a physical weight on my back, a constant, unnerving reminder that I was never, ever, truly alone. The house itself seemed to have become his ally. The familiar, comforting spaces of my childhood were now cold, sterile, and hostile. The grand sweeping staircase was a strategic vantage point. The large, elegant windows were security risks. Their heavy, velvet curtains now always drawn, plunging the house into a perpetual, gloomy twilight. The beautiful, manicured garden was a kill zone, its perimeter now lined with invisible laser tripwires and motion sensors. I was living in a beautiful, elegant, and utterly terrifying tomb. And I was beginning to realize that the threat I was being protected from was nothing compared to the slow, quiet, and utterly devastating erosion of my own soul. My father was a stranger to me now. He would come home late at night, his face etched with a new, haggard weariness. He would look at me with a mixture of a fierce, desperate love and a profound, heartbreaking guilt. He saw the cage, but he was the one who had locked the door. "It's temporary. Sarah," he would say, his voice a hollow, unconvincing thing. "Just until we deal with this Moretti situation, it's for your own good." But I saw the lie in his eyes. I saw the fear. He was a man who had made a deal with the devil, and I was the price. I stopped fighting. I stopped raging. I retreated into a cold, silent, and utterly desolate landscape of my own mind. I became a ghost in my own life. A pale, silent figure who moved through the beautiful, empty rooms of my prison. My only companion, the dark. Silent shadow who was both my keeper and my tormentor. The nights were the worst. The silence of the house was a living, breathing thing, thick with unspoken threats and a suffocating, claustrophobic tension. I would lie in bed, my eyes wide open in the darkness, and I would listen to the quiet, steady rhythm of his footsteps in the hall outside my door. He never slept. He was a sentinel, a guardian, a predator who was always, always watching. And sometimes, in the dead of the night, when the city was a distant, muted hum and the only sound was the frantic, panicked beating of my own heart, I would find myself wondering, with a new, terrifying, and utterly confusing clarity, which I was more afraid of the faceless, nameless threat that lurked outside the walls of my prison, or the cold, silent, and utterly enigmatic monster who was locked inside with me. Chapter 6, Killian. She was a fortress, a beautiful, elegant, and surprisingly resilient fortress. I had expected her to break. I had expected tears, hysterics, the predictable, messy collapse of a protected, privileged girl who had never known a moment of real hardship. I had expected to be the storm that would shatter her walls, leaving her a broken, pliable, and utterly transparent thing. I was wrong. Seraphina Hayes did not break. She bent. She retreated. She withdrew into a cold, silent, and utterly impenetrable citadel of her own mind. She was a master of a passive, silent resistance, a form of a warfare I had not anticipated, and one that I found, to my own surprise, I grudgingly respected. The isolation was complete. Her world was now a small, self-contained, and utterly controlled ecosystem of which I was the undisputed god. I controlled the flow of information, the comings and goings, the very air she breathed. I had stripped her of her friends, her freedom, her life. I had expected this to make her weak, to make her desperate, to make her turn to me, her only source of a human contact, for a comfort, for a connection, for a sliver of a light in the darkness I had created. Instead, she turned to books. She would spend hours in the library, a small, defiant figure in a world of a leather-bound history and a dense, academic theory. She would read with a fierce, focused intensity, her mind a sharp, brilliant, and utterly inaccessible thing. She did not just read the words, she consumed them, she inhabited them. She built a new world for herself within their pages, a world where I did not exist. I watched her, a silent, patient hunter, and I studied her. I studied the way the light from the reading lamp caught the gold in her dark honey hair. I studied the faint, almost imperceptible frown of a concentration that creased her brow. I studied the way her long, Elegant fingers would trace the lines of a text, as if she were absorbing the knowledge through her very skin. She was a puzzle, a beautiful, intricate, and utterly infuriating puzzle. And the more I watched her, the more I found myself drawn into the game. I began to read the books she left behind: Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz. She was not reading for pleasure. She was studying the art of war. She was learning my language. So, I changed my own tactics. I began to leave my own books for her to find, not the dry, academic tomes of a military strategy, but something else. Dostoevsky, Camus, Sartre. I was no longer just her warden. I was her teacher. And the subject was the darkness of the human soul. It was a silent, intellectual seduction, a dangerous, intoxicating game of a move and a counter-move. We were two opposing generals on a silent, beautiful, and utterly deadly battlefield, but the mission, the cold, hard equation that had brought me into her life, was always there. A low, constant hum beneath the surface of our strange, silent war. I needed to find the senator's weakness. I needed to find the one, unforgivable sin that would give Silvio Moretti the leverage he needed to own him. And to do that, I needed to break her. The nightmare was my weapon. I had heard it the first time, a small choked sound in the dead of the night. I had seen the aftermath, the pale, terrified face, the trembling hands. I knew her fear was my key. I began to cultivate it. I would move through the house in the dead of the night, a silent, invisible ghost. And I would make a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible scrape, a floorboard that creaked, a door that was left ajar. I was a poltergeist of a fear, a phantom of a paranoia, and I was slowly, methodically, and expertly turning her beautiful, elegant home into a haunted house. It was a cruel, calculated, and utterly necessary campaign of a psychological terror. And it was working. The dark circles beneath her eyes deepened. The faint, almost invisible tremor in her hands became more pronounced. She was a beautiful, tightly wound watch, and I was slowly, patiently, and expertly turning the key, one click at a time, waiting for the moment when she would finally, beautifully, and irrevocably shatter. One night, I pushed too far. The storm that had been brewing over the city for days finally broke. A wild, violent tempest of a wind and a rain and a raw, elemental fury. The power went out, plunging the house into a sudden, absolute darkness. I found her in the library, a small, terrified figure huddled in the corner, her face pale in the intermittent. Ghostly flashes of the lightning. She was not screaming, she was not crying, she was simply still. A small, fragile, and utterly broken thing. The mission dictated that I should use this moment, that I should press my advantage, that I should break her. But as I stood there, watching her in the darkness, something else, something old and dark and long buried, stirred within me. It was not pity, it was not sympathy, it was a raw, primal, and utterly possessive instinct. An urge to not just break her, but to protect her, to shield her from the storm, from the darkness, from the fear. I walked to the fireplace, and with a few efficient movements, I lit a fire. The flames leaped to life, a warm, golden light that pushed back the darkness, that cast a soft, gentle glow on her pale, terrified face. I sat in the armchair across from her, a silent, solitary guardian in the heart of the storm. I did not speak. I did not move. I simply sat there, a silent, solid, and strangely comforting weight in the darkness. And as I watched her, as the tension slowly, gradually eased from her body, as the frantic, panicked rhythm of her breathing evened out, I realized, with a new, strange, and utterly unsettling clarity, that I was no longer just the spider in the web. I was a moth, drawn to a beautiful, fragile, and utterly captivating flame, and I knew, with a cold, hard, and utterly terrifying certainty, that if I was not careful, I would be the one who would be burned. Chapter 7, Seraphina, the storm passed. As all storms do, the power returned. The rain softened to a gentle, rhythmic drumming, and the world, or at least my small, circumscribed corner of it, returned to a semblance of a normality. But something had changed. Something had broken in the darkness, in the heart of the storm. The cold, silent war between us was over. In its place was a new, fragile, and utterly confusing truce. He was no longer just a shadow in the corner, a silent, menacing specter. He was a man who had built a fire for me in the darkness, a man whose silent presence had been a strange, unexpected, and deeply comforting anchor in the storm. I no longer ignored him. I spoke to him, my voice a quiet, hesitant thing, my questions a cautious, tentative exploration of the silent, enigmatic man who had become the center of my small, circumscribed world. It was a dangerous, seductive dance. I would ask him a question, a simple, innocuous thing about a book he had left for me, about a piece of a music I was playing, about a news story I had read, and he would answer, his voice a low, careful, and utterly controlled thing, his words a series of a carefully selected, beautifully polished stones that he would drop into the quiet, still pool of our silence. He was a man of a surprising, almost shocking, depth. He knew about history, about philosophy, about art. He spoke of a Dostoevsky with the same cool, clinical precision with which he had dismantled my life. He was a puzzle, a paradox, a man of 1,000 contradictions. And I, against my better judgment, against every instinct of a self-preservation, found myself drawn deeper and deeper into the mystery of him. He began to join me in the library in the evenings. He would not sit with me. He would stand by the window, a dark, silent silhouette against the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. And he would listen as I played the piano. I had not played for months. The keys, a silent, mocking reminder of a life that was gone. But now, in the strange, quiet intimacy of our new, fragile truce, I found myself drawn back to the music. I played for him. I played the sad, beautiful, and utterly heartbreaking nocturnes of a Chopin. I played the fierce, passionate, and defiantly beautiful fugues of a Bach. I played the dark, stormy, and utterly romantic sonatas of a Beethoven. I played my heart out, my music a raw, honest, and utterly uncensored confession of everything I could not say, of everything I could not feel. And he would listen, his stillness a silent, profound, and strangely validating thing. He did not offer praise, he did not offer criticism, he simply listened, and in his listening, I felt a new, strange, and utterly intoxicating sense of a connection. I was a bird in a cage, but for the first time, I felt as if my song was being heard. One night, after I had finished playing, the final, beautiful, and heartbreaking chord of a Beethoven sonata hanging in the air between us, he spoke. You play with a beautiful, Controlled rage, he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble in the darkness. I turned to look at him, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. He had moved away from the window, and he was standing in the shadows by the fireplace, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. "It is the only rage I am allowed," I said, my voice a quiet, honest, and surprisingly steady thing. He was silent for a long, pregnant moment. And then he walked toward me. He stopped in front of the piano, his presence a dark, powerful, and utterly overwhelming thing. He reached out, and with a slow, deliberate, and almost reverent touch, he ran a single, long, elegant finger over the cool, smooth ivory of the keys. "Rage," he said, his voice a low, quiet, and strangely intimate thing, "is a weapon. It should not be wasted on a beautiful, pointless art. It should be honed. It should be focused. It should be used." He looked at me then, his eyes, those cold, stormy, and utterly unreadable eyes, holding mine with a new, strange, and utterly terrifying intensity, and in their depths, I saw not a warden, I saw not a protector, I saw a teacher, a dark, dangerous, and utterly seductive teacher. And the lesson he was offering was not one of a music, or of a philosophy, or of a history. It was a lesson in the art of a war, a lesson in the darkness of the human soul, a lesson in the beautiful, brutal, and utterly intoxicating poetry of a violence, and I, against my better judgment, against every instinct of a self-preservation, against every fiber of my being, found myself wanting, with a new, strange, and utterly terrifying hunger. To learn. Chapter 8, Killian. The music was a problem. It was an unforeseen variable, a beautiful, seductive, and utterly dangerous complication. I had intended to break her with a silence, with a fear, with a slow, meticulous, and utterly devastating erosion of her soul. I had not anticipated that she would find a new voice, a new weapon, a new language, in the 88 black and white keys of the piano in the library. She played with a raw, honest, and utterly captivating passion. Her music was a confession, a prayer, a declaration of a war. It was the sound of a beautiful, resilient, and utterly defiant soul refusing to be silenced, and it was getting under my skin. It was a distraction. It was a weakness. It was a beautiful, seductive, and utterly dangerous siren song, and it was luring me into a treacherous, uncharted, and utterly intoxicating waters. I was losing control, not of her, not of the mission, but of myself. The cold, clinical detachment that had been my armor, my shield, my greatest weapon, was beginning to crack. She was no longer just a target, an assignment, a key. She was a woman, a beautiful, intelligent, and stubbornly defiant woman. And I, against my will, against my training, against every instinct of a self-preservation, found myself wanting her. It was not a simple, physical desire. It was something more, something deeper, something darker. It was a raw, possessive, and utterly consuming need to own her, to consume her, to break her. Not for the mission, but for myself. I wanted to be the only one who heard her music. I wanted to be the only one who saw her rage. I wanted to be the only one who could make her beautifully, exquisitely, and irrevocably fall apart. The game had changed. It was no longer a simple, strategic campaign of a psychological warfare. It was a personal, intimate, and utterly deadly duel. And the stakes were no longer just the mission, they were my own soul. I knew I had to push her. I had to escalate the pressure. I had to find a new way to break her, a new way to get under her skin, a new way to find the one unforgivable sin that would give me the leverage I needed to win this game. So, I began to talk to her about her father. It was a cruel, calculated, and utterly necessary move. He was her hero, her idol, the fixed, unshakable center of her moral universe. And I knew, with the cold, hard certainty of a predator, that he was her greatest weakness. I would bring him up in our quiet, evening conversations in the library. I would ask her about his work, about his principles, about his unwavering crusade against the darkness of the city. I would listen, my face a mask of a cool, detached interest, as she spoke of him with a fierce, proud, and utterly beautiful loyalty. And then, I would plant a seed of a doubt, a small, subtle, and utterly poisonous question. A man of such unwavering principles, I would say, my voice a low, quiet, and deceptively casual thing. It is a rare and admirable thing, but is it real? I watched as the first faint flicker of a doubt appeared in her beautiful, intelligent eyes. I watched as the first, almost invisible crack appeared in the solid, unshakable foundation of her faith. I was a serpent in her garden, a dark, seductive, and utterly poisonous whisper in her ear. And the apple I was offering was not the knowledge of a good and an evil. It was the knowledge of the darkness that lurked in the heart of the man she loved most in the world. It was a dangerous, high-stakes game. If I pushed too hard, if I revealed my hand too soon, I would lose her. She would retreat back into her fortress of a silence, and the fragile, tentative trust I had so carefully, so patiently cultivated would be shattered. But I was a master of the game. I was a patient, relentless, and utterly ruthless player, and I knew, with the cold, hard certainty of a predator, that it was only a matter of a time. I would find the one unforgivable sin. I would find the one devastating truth. And I would use it to not just break her, but to own her, to make her mine, completely, utterly, and irrevocably. And the thought of it, the thought of that final, beautiful, and utterly devastating victory was a more intoxicating, more addictive, and more dangerous drug than any I had ever known. Part 3, Cracks in the Armor, Chapter 9, Seraphina. The truce held. It was a fragile, unspoken thing. A delicate crystalline structure formed in the heat of the storm and cooled in the ensuing silence. The house was no longer a tomb of oppressive quiet. It was a library, a debating hall, a confessional. Our war of attrition had evolved into a complex and dangerous dialogue. The lessons began, not with words, but with books. He would leave them for me on the heavy mahogany table in the library. Camus, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, philosophers of the abyss, explorers of despair and the beautiful, terrible freedom of a world without inherent meaning. They were not comforting. They were challenges. They were mirrors held up to the dark, chaotic world that had become my reality. And I, in turn, would respond with my own selections. I left out Locke, Rousseau, and Mill treatises on justice, social contracts, and the inherent rights of man. It was a silent, intellectual duel fought across a battlefield of paper and ink. He was showing me the world as he saw it, a brutal, amoral chaos where only strength mattered. I was trying, desperately, to remind both him and myself that another world, a world of principles and order, still existed. Idealism is the luxury of the safe, Seraphina, he said one evening. We had fallen into the habit of calling each other by our first names in the privacy of the library. It felt both intimate and dangerous. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. He had just found my copy of A Theory of Justice left open on the table. And cynicism is the crutch of the defeated, I retorted, not looking up from the piano keys my fingers were tracing. A low, humorless sound, almost a chuckle, rumbled in his chest. I am not defeated. I am a realist. There's a fine line between realism and nihilism. Killian, perhaps, he said, and I could feel his gaze on me, as tangible as a touch. But a line is a boundary, and in our world, boundaries are invitations to be crossed. His world, our world. The possessive pronoun slid into the conversation so naturally, so insidiously, that I almost didn't notice it. But I did. It was a quiet, verbal claim, an assertion of a shared reality that I both railed against and, to my shame, was beginning to accept. My father became the focal point of our silent war. Killian would weave him into our conversations with a surgeon's precision, making small, almost imperceptible incisions into the solid, unwavering edifice of my faith in him. Your father is a remarkable man, he would say, his voice a neutral, observational thing. To maintain such a black and white view of the world in a city made entirely of gray, it requires a strength of conviction that is almost unnatural. It's not unnatural, I would counter, my voice sharp with a defensiveness that felt increasingly hollow. It's called integrity. Integrity, he would muse, as if tasting the word. A beautiful concept. But what happens when one's integrity demands a sacrifice, not from oneself, but from someone one loves? His questions were poison darts, tipped with a slow-acting, corrosive venom of doubt. They were designed to make me question not my father's actions, but his motivations, to make me wonder about the cost of his crusade, and who, ultimately, was paying the price. I hated Killian for it. I hated him for the subtle, insidious way he was dismantling my world, for the dark, cynical truths he was forcing me to confront. But I also, to my own horror, found myself drawn to the cold, hard logic of his arguments. He was a monster, a creature of the shadows, but he saw the world with a clarity that was both terrifying and seductive. The house, my beautiful, elegant prison, became our chessboard. Our conversations were the moves, our silences, the strategies, and the prize, I was beginning to realize, was not just my father's secrets, it was my soul. One afternoon, I found a new book on the library table. It was not philosophy. It was a slim volume of poetry. Rilke. I opened it to a bookmarked page, and my breath caught in my throat. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. It was not a challenge. It was not a threat. It was something else. Something intimate, a confession, a plea, a glimpse into the dark, lonely, and beautiful abyss of his own soul. I looked up, and he was there, standing in the doorway, his stormy gray-green eyes holding mine, and in their depths, for the first time, I saw not a warden, not a teacher, not a predator. I saw a man who was just as trapped, just as lonely, and just as lost as I was. The fragile, crystalline structure of our truce shattered. And in its place, something new, something raw, something terrifyingly real, began to grow. It was not trust. It was not affection. It was a dangerous, unwilling, and utterly intoxicating recognition. A recognition of a shared darkness, a shared loneliness, a shared and beautiful terror. And I knew, with a sudden, soul-shattering certainty, that this man, this monster, this beautiful, broken, and utterly enigmatic shadow was the only person in the world who could ever truly understand me. Chapter 10, Killian. The Rilke was a mistake, a calculated risk that had backfired in a way I had not anticipated. I had intended it to be another move in our game, another subtle, psychological tool to destabilize her, to make her question the finality of her own grief, her own fear. I had not expected it to be a key that would unlock a door in myself that I had thought was sealed shut, welded over with a scar tissue and a cold, hard, and utterly impenetrable indifference. When she looked up at me from the book, her beautiful, intelligent blue eyes wide with a sudden, shocking understanding, I felt something I had not felt in a lifetime. I felt seen. It was a terrifying, disorienting, and utterly unwelcome sensation. I was a man who lived in the shadows, a creature of a secrets and a lies and a carefully constructed anonymity. To be seen, to be truly seen, was to be vulnerable, and vulnerability, in my world, was a death sentence. I retreated. I rebuilt the walls, fortified the defenses, resurrected the cold, silent, and utterly emotionless specter of the man I was supposed to be. I became her warden again, a dark, silent, and unreadable presence in the corner of her life. But it was too late. The connection had been made. The silent, invisible thread that had been weaving itself between us was now a tangible, undeniable thing. It was in the way she would look at me when she thought I wasn't watching. Her eyes full of a new, cautious curiosity. It was in the way she would play the piano in the evenings. Her music no longer just a lament, but a question, a conversation, a beautiful, heartbreaking, and utterly seductive invitation. She was getting under my skin. She was a fever in my blood, a beautiful, addictive poison that was slowly, methodically, and expertly dismantling my carefully constructed world. I found myself thinking about her at odd hours of the day, the memory of her scent, the sound of her laughter, the image of her face, a constant, distracting, and utterly infuriating presence in my mind. The mission, the cold, hard, and utterly logical reason for my presence in her life, was becoming a distant, secondary thing. My obsession was no longer with finding the senator's weakness. It was with her. I was losing control, and I knew, with the cold, hard certainty of a predator who has suddenly found himself caught in a trap, that I had to do something to regain it. I had to remind myself of who I was, of what I was. I had to remind her. So, I brought the darkness to her door. I arranged for a package to be delivered, a simple, elegant, and utterly terrifying message from the world she was being protected from. It was a small, beautifully crafted wooden box, tied with a black silk ribbon. Inside, on a bed of a black velvet, was a single, perfect, and utterly dead white rose. Its petals were bruised, its stem snapped. I was in the library with her when the package arrived. I watched as she opened it, her face a mask of a cool, detached curiosity. I watched as her eyes widened in a sudden, shocking understanding. I watched as the color drained from her face, leaving her a pale, beautiful, and utterly terrified statue. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice a small, broken thing. "It is a message," I said, my voice a cold, flat, and utterly emotionless thing. "From the Moretti family. It is a promise. A promise of what that they can reach you," I said, my voice a low, quiet, and utterly brutal thing. "That no wall is high enough, no guard is strong enough, that they can touch you. Whenever, wherever, and however they please." I expected her to cry. I expected her to scream. I expected her to turn to me, her only source of a safety, for a comfort, for a reassurance. She did none of those things. She simply looked at the dead rose, her face a mask of a cold, still, and utterly unreadable emotion. And then she looked at me, and in her beautiful, intelligent, and now chillingly clear blue eyes, I saw not fear, I saw not terror, I saw a new, cold, hard, and utterly terrifying resolve. "Then you are failing in your job, Mr. Black," she said, her voice a quiet, steady, and utterly devastating thing. "Perhaps you are not as absolute as my father was led to believe," and in that moment, I knew, with a sudden, soul-shattering certainty, that I had made a terrible, terrible mistake. I had not reminded her of who I was. I had reminded her of who she was: a fighter, a survivor, a queen. And I had just handed her a new weapon, a weapon she would not hesitate to use against me. The game had not just changed, it had escalated, and I, for the first time in my life, had no idea how to win. Chapter 11 to Seraphina. The dead rose was not a threat. It was a declaration of war, and it was a gift. It was the one thing I needed to shatter the strange, seductive, and utterly dangerous spell that had been weaving itself around me in the quiet, fire-lit intimacy of the library. It was a bucket of ice water to the face, a slap of a cold, hard reality that woke me from the beautiful, terrifying dream I had been living. Killian Black was not my confidant. He was not my teacher. He was not my dark, lonely, and misunderstood soulmate. He was my enemy. He was the architect of my prison, the master of my fear, the silent, patient, and utterly ruthless spider in the web. And I had been a fool, a naive, romantic, and utterly stupid fool to believe otherwise. The fragile, tentative truce between us was not just broken, it was obliterated. The library was no longer our debating hall, our confessional, our silent, intimate sanctuary. It was a battlefield, and the war was no longer a silent, intellectual duel. It was a cold, hard, and utterly personal fight for my own survival. I stopped playing the piano for him. I stopped engaging in his dark, seductive, and utterly manipulative conversations. I retreated back into the fortress of my own mind, but this time, it was not a passive, defensive withdrawal. It was a strategic, offensive one. I was no longer just a prisoner. I was a spy. I watched him. I studied him. I dissected his every move, his every word, his every silence. I was looking for a crack in his armor, a chink in his defenses, a weakness I could exploit. I was using the very tactics he had taught me against him. I was learning the art of war, and the first thing I learned was that he was lying. The dead rose, the so-called message from the Moretti family. It was too clean, too theatrical, too perfect. It was not the messy, brutal, and utterly terrifying work of a desperate, violent crime family. It was the cold, calculated, and utterly precise work of a master manipulator. It was his move, a cruel, calculated, and utterly devastating move in his own private, twisted game. The realization was a cold, hard, and utterly liberating thing. I was not a pawn in a war between my father and the Moretti family. I was a pawn in a war between Killian Black and myself, and for the first time since he had walked into my life, I felt a surge of a pure, unadulterated, and utterly exhilarating power. I finally understood the rules of the game, and I was no longer going to play by his. The attack came on a Friday. It was not a dead rose in a box. It was not a psychological game. It was a real, brutal, and utterly terrifying reality. I was in my father's study, a room I was not supposed to be in, a room that was supposed to be off limits. I was looking for something, anything, a clue, a piece of a paper, a forgotten file. That would give me some leverage, some weapon, to use against my own personal, private tyrant. The house was quiet. My father was at a late-night session at the Senate. Killian was a silent, brooding presence in the library, or so I thought. I had been so careful. I had waited until the house was asleep. I had moved with a silent, stealthy grace I had not known I possessed. I was in front of my father's desk, my fingers tracing the cold, hard lines of the locked drawers, when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scrape from the direction of the French doors that led out to the garden. I froze, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs, and then I heard it again, the soft, metallic click of a lock being picked. I did not have time to think. I did not have time to scream. I simply reacted. I dove under the massive, mahogany desk, my body a small, tight, and utterly terrified ball. The doors swung open with a soft, almost gentle whoosh. Two figures, dressed in black from head to toe, their faces obscured by ski masks, slipped into the room. They moved with a silent, fluid grace, their movements the economical, practiced motions of professionals. They were not common thugs, they were killers. My world shrank to the small, dark, and utterly terrifying space beneath my father's desk. I could see their feet, two pairs of a black, military-style boots, as they moved silently, methodically, through the room. They were not looking for me. They were looking for something else, something in my father's desk. One of them stopped in front of the desk. He knelt down, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought he had seen me, but he was reaching for the locked drawers, a set of slim, metallic tools in his hand. And then, the world exploded. It was not a sound that I heard, but a force that I felt. A sudden, violent concussion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The man in front of the desk was thrown backward, a look of shocked, uncomprehending surprise on his face. A small, dark, and perfectly round hole appearing in the center of his forehead. The second man spun around, his own weapon raised. But he was too slow. A dark shape descended from the shadows of the doorway. A silent, avenging angel of death. Killian. He moved with a speed and a brutality that was almost inhuman. It was not a fight. It was an execution. A blur of motion, a flash of steel, a series of short, sharp, and sickeningly wet sounds. It was over in seconds. The second man lay on the floor, his throat a gaping, bloody wound. The silence that followed was a ringing, deafening thing, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Killian stood over the two dead men, his chest heaving, a thin, elegant stiletto clutched in his hand, its blade dripping with a dark, viscous liquid. He was not the cold, controlled warden of my prison. He was not the reluctant, almost gentle teacher of our silent, intellectual war. He was a killer, a predator, a creature of pure, unadulterated violence. He turned to look at the desk, his eyes a dark, molten fire in the dim, moonlit room. He was breathing hard, his body a taut, coiled spring of adrenaline and a raw, murderous fury. "Seraphina," he said, his voice a raw, ragged thing, stripped of its usual cold control. "Come out." I crawled out from under the desk, my body trembling with the violent, shuddering aftermath of the attack. I looked at him, at the blood on his hands, at the two dead men on the floor, at the cold, hard, and utterly terrifying reality of who he was. And I did not feel fear. I did not feel revulsion. I felt a new, strange, and utterly terrifying sense of a gratitude. He had saved my life. This monster, this killer, this beautiful, broken, and utterly enigmatic shadow. He had saved my life. He stalked toward me, and for a moment, I thought he was going to be angry, that he was going to punish me for being in my father's study, for disobeying his rules. But he did not. He stopped in front of me, his gaze sweeping over me, a frantic, desperate search for injury. He reached out, his hand, the one that was not holding the bloody knife, and he cupped my face, his fingers a trembling, almost reverent cage around my jaw. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a raw, ragged thing. I shook my head, my own body trembling with a violent, shuddering aftermath of the attack. "No." A sound. A raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated relief, tore from his throat. And then he pulled me into his arms. His embrace was not gentle. It was a hard, bruising, and utterly desperate thing. A silent, violent promise of protection. He held me so tightly I could barely breathe, his face buried in my hair, his body a solid, unyielding wall of muscle against my own. The shared danger, the constant, simmering tension, the raw, undeniable intimacy of our strange, twisted relationship, it all culminated in that moment. The fragile, unspoken truce between us was shattered, and in its place, something new, something raw, something terrifyingly real, was born. He broke the embrace and looked down at me, his eyes a dark, stormy sea of 100 unreadable emotions, and then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of possession. It was not a kiss of comfort. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated desperation, a kiss that said, "I almost lost you," a kiss that was a raw, primal, and utterly selfish claiming. I kissed him back, my own desperation matching his, a raw, hungry need for the life, the heat, the brutal, beautiful reality of him. I clung to him, my body arching against his, my hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, deeper. This was not a game. This was not a strategy. This was something else, something raw, something real, something terrifying. And in the heart of the violence, in the crucible of blood and fear, I had finally, irrevocably, and utterly surrendered. Our silent, intellectual war was over, and a new, more dangerous, and infinitely more intoxicating battle had just begun. Chapter 12. Killian. The taste of her was a revelation. It was the taste of a rain-soaked earth, of a wild, untamed honey, of a strength and a vulnerability and a fire that I had not known I was starving for. The kiss was not a strategic move. It was not a calculated act of a seduction. It was a complete and utter loss of a control, a catastrophic failure of a AA discipline, a beautiful, exquisite, and utterly devastating surrender. I was a man who lived by a single, unshakable creed control. I controlled my emotions, my environment, my men. I controlled the dark, violent, and utterly chaotic world in which I lived. I was the conductor, the master of the symphony, the one who dictated the rhythm, the tempo, the very soul of the music, and in a single, desperate, and utterly intoxicating moment, Seraphina Hayes had shattered my baton, ripped the score to shreds, and plunged my carefully composed world into a wild, beautiful, and utterly terrifying chaos. The two dead men on the floor, the smell of a blood and a cordite in the air, the cold, hard reality of the war. We were in it all faded into the background. There was only her. The soft, yielding warmth of her body against mine, the frantic, desperate rhythm of her heart against my chest, the sweet, intoxicating taste of her on my tongue. I broke the kiss, my breath a ragged, desperate thing in my lungs. I looked down at her, at the beautiful, flushed face, the wide, dazed eyes, the swollen, kiss-bruised lips, and I saw not a target. I saw not a key. I saw a woman who had, in the space of a few short weeks, become the single, unshakable, and utterly terrifying center of my universe. The mission was a ghost, a distant, fading echo in the roaring, deafening silence of my own heart. The senator, Silvio Moretti, the intricate, deadly game I had been playing, it was all meaningless. There is only one thing that mattered now. Her safety, her life. I had come to this house to break her, to dismantle her, to use her as a weapon. And now, I would burn the world to the ground to keep her safe. I lifted her in my arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her from the study, from the room that now reeked of a death and a violence, leaving the two dead men behind for the silent, efficient cleaners who were already on their way. I carried her to her own suite, and I laid her on her bed, the sheets cool and crisp against her skin. I expected her to pull away, to retreat back into the fortress of her fear and her anger. But she did not. She looked up at me, her beautiful, intelligent blue eyes clear and steady and filled with a new, strange, and utterly terrifying understanding. She reached out, and with a slow, deliberate, and almost reverent touch, she traced the line of my jaw, her fingers a soft, gentle, and utterly devastating fire on my skin. That was not the Moretti family, was it? She asked, her voice a quiet, steady thing. I did not answer for a long, pregnant moment. The lie was on the tip of my tongue, the easy, practiced deception that had been my shield, my weapon, my very skin. For as long as I could remember, but I could not say it. Not to her. Not now. No, I said, my voice a raw, honest thing. It was not. Who were they? A rival faction, I said. The truth a strange, foreign, and utterly liberating thing on my tongue. Men who want your father dead, for reasons that have nothing to do with Silvio Moretti. She was silent for a long, pregnant moment, her gaze never leaving mine. And then she nodded. A slow, deliberate, and utterly devastating acceptance of the new, brutal, and infinitely more complicated reality of her life. So, "There are two monsters hunting me," she said, her voice a quiet, resigned, and strangely calm thing, the one I know, and the one I don't. "There is only one monster in this house. Seraphina," I said, my voice a low, quiet, and utterly honest thing. "And he will not let anyone touch you." I leaned down and I kissed her again, a slow, gentle, and utterly possessive kiss. It was not a kiss of a passion, it was a brand, a claim, a silent, unbreakable vow, a promise that I would kill for her, that I would die for her, that I would become a monster 1,000 times more terrible than any that lurked in the darkness to keep her safe. And as I kissed her, as I felt the soft, yielding surrender of her body against mine, I knew, with a terrifying, soul-shattering certainty, that I was no longer just a soldier in Silvio Moretti's army. I was a king without a kingdom, a god without a religion, a man who had found the one, single, and utterly irreplaceable thing in the universe that he would not, could not, and would never, ever, lose. And her name was Seraphina Hayes. The game had not just changed. It was over. And anew, more dangerous, and infinitely more beautiful one had just begun. Part 4. The Art of Manipulation. Chapter 13. Seraphina. The morning after was a study in silence. A heavy, profound quiet had descended upon the house, thicker and more suffocating than any that had come before. The world outside continued its inexorable spin a pale, watery sun was attempting to break through the bruised clouds. The distant sounds of city traffic were a muted, rhythmic hum, but inside the walls of the townhouse, time had fractured. It was a place outside of the normal flow of life, a pocket of reality where the only things that existed were the lingering scent of blood and bleach, the ghost of violence, and the memory of a kiss that had tasted like desperation and ruin. They had been efficient, his cleaners. The study was immaculate, the rich mahogany of my father's desk gleaming, the Persian rug showing no sign of the life that had been so brutally spilled upon it. The French doors were repaired, the glass pristine. It was as if nothing had happened. It was as if two men had not died on that floor. It was as if I hadn't been saved by a monster and then, to my eternal shame, kissed him as if he were my savior. The denial was a tempting, seductive balm, but my body remembered. My lips still tingled with the memory of his, a phantom pressure that was both a brand and a wound. My skin remembered the hard, bruising strength of his arms, the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. My soul remembered the terrifying, exhilarating plunge from the precipice of fear into the dark, churning abyss of a desire I hadn't known I possessed. I was in a state of profound and terrifying confusion. I was a scholar, a creature of logic and reason. I had built my life on a foundation of definable principles and observable truths. And now, my entire world had been reduced to a single, unsolvable paradox. Killian Black. He was the architect of my fear, and the only man who made me feel safe. He was my captor, and my protector. He was a ruthless, cold-blooded killer, and the man whose touch had set my body on fire with a life I hadn't felt in months. He was my enemy, and I was, to my horror, beginning to think that he was the only person on earth who truly saw me. I decided, in the cold, clear light of that fractured morning, that I would play his game. I would feign trust. I would feign surrender. I would wear the mask of the broken, grateful victim, and I would watch him. I would learn him. I would dissect him. piece by piece, until I understood the intricate, beautiful, and terrifying machinery of his mind. I needed to know who the real enemy was. Was it Silvio Moretti? Was it the faceless, nameless men who had come for me in the night? Or was it the man who now stood as the solitary guardian of my gilded cage? The man whose kiss was a poison I now craved. I found him in the library. He was standing by the window, a dark, silent silhouette against the pale morning light. A mug of what I assumed was coffee cradled in his long, elegant hands. He turned as I entered, and his eyes, those stormy, unreadable gray-green eyes, swept over me. A quick, clinical assessment. "You should eat," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble, devoid of the raw, ragged edge of the night before. The mask was back in place, the cold, controlled, and utterly impenetrable wall of his professional detachment was once again standing between us. It was as if the kiss, the desperate, world-shattering collision of our bodies and our souls, had never happened. A part of me, the logical, rational part, was relieved. But another part, a new, dark, and hungry part, felt a sharp, bitter sting of disappointment. "I'm not hungry," I said, my own voice a cool, steady thing. I walked to the bookshelf, my hand tracing the spines of the familiar, comforting volumes. I was playing a role now, the part of a woman who was trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy in the aftermath of a trauma. It was a role I knew he would understand. It was a role he would expect. "You need to maintain your strength," he said, his voice closer now. I turned, and he was standing just a few feet away, his presence a dark, powerful, and utterly overwhelming thing. "And you are the expert on strength, I presume?" I asked, my voice laced with a subtle, challenging irony. A flicker of something, a ghost of a smile, touched the corner of his mouth. "I am the expert on survival. Seraphina," he said, his use of my first name a quiet, intimate claim in the silent, sun-drenched room. And they are not the same thing. He was right. Of course, I was a survivor of my grief, of my isolation, of the attack. And now, I had to survive him. The game had changed, and the stakes were no longer just my freedom. They were my very soul. And as I looked into the cold, beautiful, and utterly terrifying eyes of the man who was both my enemy and my protector, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was a game I could not afford to lose. Chapter 14, Killian Control. It was the first and last commandment of my world, the bedrock of my existence, the one, unshakable principle in a life built on a foundation of chaos and violence, and I had lost it in a single, catastrophic, and utterly unforgivable moment of weakness. I had allowed a variable, a beautiful, intelligent, and stubbornly defiant variable named Seraphina Hayes to shatter my discipline and plunge my mission into a treacherous, uncharted, and potentially fatal territory. The kiss was a tactical error of a monumental proportions. It was a breach of a protocol, a violation of every rule, every principle. That had kept me alive in a world that was designed to kill me. It was a moment of a pure, unadulterated, and utterly selfish indulgence, and it had changed everything. I stood in the library, a mug of a black, unsweetened coffee growing cold in my hands, and I watched her. She was playing a role, the part of the fragile, traumatized victim, and she was playing it beautifully. But I was not an amateur. I was a connoisseur of a deception, a master of the art of the lie. And I knew, with the cold, hard certainty of an IA professional, that she was lying. There was a new light in her eyes, a new, cold, hard, and utterly terrifying resolve. The fear was still there, a faint, lingering shadow in the depths of her beautiful, intelligent blue eyes. But it was no longer the dominant emotion. It had been replaced by something else. Something sharp. Something dangerous. She was no longer just a pawn in my game. She was a player. And the game had just become infinitely more interesting. I spent the morning cleaning up the mess. Not the physical mess. My men. The silent, efficient ghosts who moved in my wake. Had taken care of that before the sun had even risen. The 2 bodies were gone. The study was immaculate. The security of the townhouse had been tripled. No. The mess I was cleaning up was the one inside my own head. I made the call to Silvio Moretti. It was a conversation of a carefully constructed half-truths and a deliberate omissions. I reported the attack, framing it as a failed attempt by a rival faction to send a message to the senator. I assured him that the target was secure, that the situation was under control. I did not mention the kiss. I did not mention the raw, possessive, and utterly unprofessional instinct that had driven me to kill, not just to neutralize a threat, but to protect what I was now, to my own horror, beginning to consider mine. Silvio listened, his voice a low, reptilian hiss on the other end of the secure line. He was a patient, calculating, and utterly ruthless man, a snake in a $1,000 suit. And he was not a fool. "You sound different, Killian," he said, his voice a soft, silken, and utterly menacing thing, almost emotional. "I do not have emotions." "Silvio," I said, my own voice a cold, flat, and utterly emotionless thing. "I have objectives, and the objective remains the same." "Good," he hissed. "Because my patience is not infinite. Find the senator's sin, Killian. Find it soon, or I will be forced to take a more direct approach. And I can assure you, the girl will not enjoy it." The threat was a cold, hard knot of a pure, unadulterated rage in my gut. The thought of Silvio's soft, manicured hands on her, the thought of his reptilian eyes on her beautiful, defiant face, it was a red, blinding, an utterly murderous thing. I ended the call, my hand crushing the secure, military-grade phone in my fist. The mission was no longer just a mission. It was a race against Silvio's dwindling patience, a race against the rival faction that was still out there. A faceless, nameless threat in the darkness, a race against the beautiful, intelligent, and dangerously observant woman who was currently playing a game of her own just a few rooms away. I needed to regain control. I needed to reestablish my dominance. I needed to shrink her world until the only person in it, the only person she could see, the only person she could think about, was me. I walked back into the library. She was standing by the window, her back to me, her arms wrapped around herself in a gesture that was both defensive and vulnerable. "Pack a bag," I said, my voice a cold, hard, and utterly non-negotiable thing. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide with a new, wary surprise. "Why we're leaving the city?" I said. "The townhouse is no longer secure. I have a place in the country. A safe house. We will be going there. Indefinitely. And my father, The senator will be safer knowing that you are, I said, the lie a smooth, practiced, and utterly convincing thing on my tongue. This is not a request. Seraphina, it is a security protocol. You have 1 hour. I watched as a dozen different emotions warred in her beautiful, expressive face. Fear, anger, suspicion, and a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of a something else. A reluctant, unwilling, and utterly undeniable curiosity. She did not argue. She simply nodded. A short, sharp, and utterly resigned gesture. And as she walked past me, her scent, a subtle, intoxicating mix of old books and a wild, untamed freesias, a ghost of a touch on the air, I felt a surge of a cold, hard, and utterly triumphant satisfaction. I had her. The game was mine again. I was taking her away from her world, from her life, from everything she knew. I was taking her to a place where there would be no distractions, no interruptions, no escape. A place where there would be only me. The art of a manipulation was a simple, elegant thing. It was about controlling the environment. It was about creating a dependency. It was about becoming the one, single, and utterly indispensable source of a safety, of a information, of a life itself. And I, Killian Black, was an artist. And Seraphina Hayes was about to become my masterpiece. Chapter 15. Seraphina. The drive was a silent, 4-hour journey into the heart of a beautiful, desolate, and utterly terrifying nothingness. We left the city behind, its familiar, comforting chaos replaced by the vast, empty, and strangely menacing beauty of the Virginia countryside. The late autumn landscape was a symphony of a muted, melancholy colors, the deep, bruised purple of the distant mountains, the pale, anemic gold of the harvested fields, the stark, skeletal black of the leafless trees against a vast, indifferent gray sky. It was beautiful, and it was the most terrifying place I had ever been. The safe house was not a house. It was a statement. A sleek, modern fortress of a glass and a steel and a cold, dark stone, perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking a wild, churning river. It was a masterpiece of a minimalist architecture, a beautiful, elegant, and utterly soulless thing. It was a cage with a better view. Cale Killian, I corrected myself. The name a strange, foreign, and yet increasingly familiar thing on my tongue was a silent, imposing presence beside me in the car. He drove with a relaxed, economical grace, his large, powerful hands resting lightly on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He was a man in his element, a predator who was just as comfortable in the wild, untamed beauty of the countryside as he was in the dark, violent and utterly chaotic jungle of the city. The silence between us was not the empty, hostile silence of our first few days together. It was a different kind of a quiet, a charged, humming, and utterly electric thing, thick with the unspoken memory of the kiss, of the violence, of the raw, undeniable connection that had been forged between us in the crucible of a blood and a fear. I had packed a single bag, a small, carefully curated collection of the things I could not live without. Books, my laptop, a small framed photograph of my mother. I had left behind the beautiful, expensive, and utterly meaningless trappings of my old life. I was a soldier now, and I was traveling light. The house was as beautiful and as soulless on the inside as it was on the outside. It was a world of polished concrete floors, of a vast unadorned walls of a glass, of a sleek, minimalist furniture in a shades of a black, a white, and a gray. It was a house that was designed not to be lived in, but to be observed. A house that was designed for a man who was more of a ghost than a person. He showed me to my room. It was a vast, beautiful, and utterly impersonal space, its one single wall of a glass offering a breathtaking, dizzying view of the river and the valley below. "You will be safe here," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble in the stillness of the room. "Safe from who?" Killian, I asked, my own voice a quiet, steady thing. "From the men who attacked me, or from you." He turned to look at me, and for a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of a something in his eyes, a ghost of an emotion too quick, too fleeting, to name, surprise, annoyance, or something else. Something vulnerable. "They are one and the same." "Are they not?" I pressed, my voice a soft, silken, and utterly dangerous thing, the monsters in the dark, and the monster in the light. A slow, cold smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You are learning, Seraphina," he said, his voice a low, quiet, and strangely intimate thing. "Good." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the beautiful, empty, and utterly terrifying silence of my new prison. The days at the safe house settled into a strange, new, and utterly disorienting rhythm. The claustrophobic, monitored confinement of the townhouse was gone. Here, I had the illusion of a freedom. I could walk through the vast, empty rooms of the house. I could sit on the wide, wind-swept terrace and watch the river churn and foam below. I could breathe the crisp, clean, and strangely lonely country air. But it was a lie. I was more of a prisoner here than I had ever been in the city. The isolation was absolute. There were no neighbors, no passing cars, no signs of a life other than the occasional distant cry of a hawk circling in the vast empty sky. My world had shrunk until it consisted of a single, solitary person. Him. He was a constant, unnerving presence. He was my cook, my guard, my sole source of a human contact. Our lives, once two separate, distinct, and utterly opposing things, were now intertwined. Our days a slow, quiet, and utterly intoxicating dance of a proximity and a distance. Our conversations, the silent, intellectual duel that had begun in the library, continued. But the tone had changed. It was no longer just a game of a move and a countermove. It was a slow, patient, and utterly seductive exploration. He was no longer just trying to find my weaknesses. He was trying to find me. He would ask me about my childhood, about my mother, about my dreams. His questions were a surgeon's scalpel, sharp, precise, and utterly relentless. He was dissecting me, piece by piece, and I, to my own horror, found myself letting him. I told him about my mother, about her love of a poetry, about the beautiful, sad, and utterly profound emptiness she had left behind when she died. I told him about my childhood, about my lonely, bookish world, about my desperate, unending quest for my father's approval, and in return, he would offer me small, carefully selected, and utterly captivating fragments of A himself. He told me about his own childhood, not the truth. I knew that now, but a beautifully crafted, utterly convincing fiction. He told me he had grown up in the foster system, a lost, angry boy who had found a home, a purpose, a family, in the cold, hard, and utterly unforgiving world of the military. He told me about the wars he had fought, about the things he had seen, about the man he had become. It was a lie. I knew it was a lie, but it was a beautiful, seductive, and utterly heartbreaking lie. And I, against my better judgment, against every instinct of a self-preservation, found myself wanting, with a new, strange, and utterly terrifying hunger, to believe it. We were two liars, two spies, two opposing generals on a silent, beautiful, and utterly deadly battlefield. And the lines between us, the lines between the truth and the lie, between the game and the reality, between the hate and the desire, were becoming dangerously, beautifully, and irrevocably blurred. Chapter 16. Killian. The safe house was a perfect, sterile environment for the delicate, dangerous experiment I was conducting. The isolation was a crucible, a high-pressure chamber designed to strip away the unnecessary, to distill a person down to their purest, most essential essence. I had brought Seraphina here to break her, to find the one fatal flaw in her beautiful, intricate, and utterly fascinating design. But the experiment was having an unforeseen and utterly dangerous side effect. It was distilling me down to my own essence as well, and I was beginning to realize, with a new, strange, and utterly terrifying clarity, that my own essence was not the cold, hard, and utterly emotionless thing I had believed it to be. She was a fever in my blood, a beautiful, addictive, and utterly maddening presence that had infiltrated my carefully constructed world, that had bypassed my defenses, that had set up a permanent, non-negotiable residence in the one, single, and supposedly impregnable fortress of my own mind. I watched her as she moved through the cold, minimalist spaces of the house, a small, vibrant, and utterly captivating spark of a life in the beautiful, soulless tomb I had created. She was a splash of a color in my monochrome world, a beautiful, unexpected, and utterly disruptive melody in my silent, ordered life. Our conversations were a dangerous, intoxicating drug. I was a master of the interrogation, of the subtle, psychological art of the extracting information. But with her, it was different. It was not an interrogation, it was a confession. And I was the one who was confessing. I had told her lies about my past. Of course, beautiful, carefully crafted, and utterly convincing lies. But the emotions behind the lies, the loneliness, the anger, the deep, ancient, and utterly profound sense of a loss, they were real. I was giving her the truth, just wrapped in a more palatable, less monstrous package. And she, in turn, was giving me the truth as well. I could see it in the way her beautiful, intelligent blue eyes would soften when she spoke of her mother. I could hear it in the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her voice when she spoke of her desperate, unending need for her father's love. She was giving me the keys to her kingdom, the blueprints to her fortress, and I, the patient, relentless, and utterly ruthless conqueror, was taking them, one by one, and I was using them to map the path to her ultimate, beautiful, and utterly devastating destruction. I was close. I could feel it. The secret. The one, unforgivable sin that would give me the leverage I needed to own her father. It was there, just beneath the surface of her beautiful, tragic, and utterly compelling story. It was a dark, silent, and utterly monstrous thing, and it was hiding in the one, single, and supposedly unassailable bastion of her father's perfect, righteous, and utterly fraudulent integrity. The call from Silvio Moretti came on a Wednesday. It was a cold, clear, and utterly unforgiving day. The senator is making a new push for the RICO Act. Silvio hissed, his voice a low, reptilian thing on the other end of the secure line. He is becoming a problem. Killian. A problem that needs to be solved. I am tired of your games. I am tired of your delays. I want the leverage. I want it now. Or I will solve the problem myself. And I can assure you, my solution will be far less subtle. The threat was a cold, hard, and utterly familiar thing. But this time, it was different. It was not just a threat against the mission, it was a threat against her. I ended the call, a new, cold, hard, and utterly terrifying resolve settling in my gut. The game was over. The time for a subtlety, for a patience, for a slow, seductive, and utterly intoxicating dance of a manipulation was over. I needed to find the secret, and I needed to find it now. I went to her. She was on the terrace, a small solitary figure wrapped in a thick, cashmere sweater. Her face turned to the vast, empty, and strangely menacing beauty of the valley below. I did not waste time with a subtlety. I did not waste time with a seduction. I went straight for the jugular. "Tell me about the night your mother died," I said. My voice a cold, hard, and utterly brutal thing. She flinched as if I had struck her. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, shocked, and utterly wounded surprise. Why, she whispered, her voice a small, broken thing. "Because your father is lying about it," I said. The lie a sharp, brutal, and utterly necessary weapon. Because there is a secret in that night. Seraphina. A secret that he has been hiding from you your entire life. A secret that is about to get you killed. I watched as the color drained from her face. I watched as the beautiful, intelligent, and stubbornly defiant light in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a new, cold, hard, and utterly terrifying fear. I had her. The final wall had been breached. The fortress was about to fall. And I, the patient, relentless, and utterly ruthless conqueror, was about to claim my victory. And the thought of it, the thought of that final, beautiful, and utterly devastating moment of a surrender, was a more intoxicating, more addictive, and more dangerous drug than any I had ever known. And I knew, with a terrifying, soul-shattering certainty, that the price of that victory would be not just her soul, but my own as well. The Lying Guard, Part 5. A Dangerous Affection, 117. Seraphina, the truth, once revealed, was a poison with no antidote. It seeped into the foundations of my world, not with a sudden, violent explosion, but with the slow, inexorable creep of a toxic tide, tainting every memory, every belief, every certainty I had ever held dear. My mother's death was not a tragedy. It was a lie, a beautifully constructed, carefully maintained, an utterly soul-crushing lie. And my father, the unwavering bastion of my moral universe, was its architect. Killian's words, delivered with the cold, brutal precision of a surgeon's scalpel, had done more than just wound me. They had performed a vivisection on my soul, cutting away the scar tissue of my grief to reveal the festering, gangrenous wound of a betrayal that was almost too vast to comprehend. The days that followed were a study in a new kind of silence. The charged, intellectual quiet of our strange, dangerous courtship was gone, replaced by a dead, hollow, and utterly desolate emptiness. I retreated into myself, not into the fortress of my books, but into the rubble of my own shattered mind. I was a ghost in a haunted house. And the ghost that was haunting me was the memory of a truth I could no longer unknow. I replayed the night of my mother's death in my mind, a grainy, faded home movie that I now watched with a new, terrifying clarity. The details, once softened by the gauze of a childhood grief, were now sharp, jagged, and utterly damning. The argument in my father's study, the sound of my mother's raised, desperate voice, the sharp, violent slam of a door, the squeal of tires in the driveway, the sudden, deafening silence that had followed. I had been a child. I had not understood. I had accepted the story I was told, the simple, tragic narrative of an accident, of a slippery road, of a beautiful, vibrant life extinguished in a single, random, and utterly meaningless moment. But it was not random. It was not meaningless. It was the end of an argument. It was the final, desperate, and ultimately fatal act of a woman who had been trying to escape. And my father had let her go. He had stood in that study, in the heart of his perfect, beautiful, and utterly fraudulent world, and he had watched her drive into the storm, into the darkness, into her death. He had not stopped her. He had not saved her. He had simply allowed it to happen. The knowledge was a physical weight, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of my stomach. It was a truth so monstrous, so profound, that it threatened to shatter the very foundations of my sanity. And the only person in the world who knew, the only person who understood, was the monster who was locked inside this beautiful, desolate prison with me. Killian watched me. I could feel his gaze on me, a constant, unnerving, and strangely patient presence. He did not press me. He did not offer false comfort. He simply waited. He had planted the poison, and now he was waiting for it to do its work. Our conversations, when they happened, were brief, functional, and utterly devoid of the intellectual sparring, the subtle, seductive dance of our previous life. We were two strangers sharing a beautiful, empty, and utterly soulless tomb. But the silence between us was not empty. It was charged with a new, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating current. The wall between us, the cold, impenetrable barrier of his professional detachment and my own fearful, defiant resistance had been breached. The truth, the terrible, beautiful, and utterly devastating truth, was a bridge between us, a dark, treacherous, and yet strangely solid thing that connected our two lonely, broken souls. I found myself watching him, my own gaze a new, cautious, and utterly desperate thing. I was no longer just studying him as an enemy. I was studying him as the one, single, and utterly terrifying constant in my new, fractured reality. He was the one who had told me the truth. He was the one who had shattered my world, and he was the one who was now, to my own horror and confusion, the only person I felt I could trust. He was a killer. He was a monster. He was a creature of the shadows. But he was an honest monster. He had never pretended to be anything other than what he was. And in a world that had suddenly been revealed to be a beautiful, intricate, and utterly devastating lie, his brutal, uncompromising honesty was a strange, unexpected, and deeply seductive comfort. One night, I found him on the terrace. The air was cold and crisp, the sky a vast, inky canvas pricked with the sharp, distant light of a million stars. He was standing at the railing, a dark, solitary figure against the vast, empty, and strangely beautiful nothingness of the night. I did not know what I was going to say. I did not know what I wanted. I only knew that I could not bear the silence, the emptiness, the terrible, crushing weight of my own shattered heart. For another moment, I walked to the railing and stood beside him, my arms wrapped around myself against the cold. We stood in silence for a long, pregnant moment. The only sound the distant, mournful cry of an owl and the soft, rhythmic rushing of the river in the valley below. "How did you know?" I asked, my voice a small, quiet thing in the vast, empty silence of the night. He did not pretend to misunderstand. "There are no secrets in this world, Seraphina," he said, his own voice a low, quiet rumble. "Only lies that have not yet been exposed. And you are the one who exposes them." "It is my job," he said. A statement of fact, not of pride. "And what is your job, Killian?" I asked, my voice a soft, silken, and utterly dangerous thing. "Are you a protector? A warden? Or are you just a professional liar?" He turned to look at me then, and in the dim, silvery light of the moon, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a ghost of an emotion too quick, too fleeting, to name. It was not anger. It was not annoyance. It was something raw, something vulnerable. "I am whatever the mission requires me to be," he said, his voice a low, quiet, and strangely honest thing. "And what does the mission require you to be now?" I pressed, my voice a whisper, a challenge, an invitation. He was silent for a long, pregnant moment. He looked out at the vast, empty, and beautiful darkness of the night, at the cold, distant, and utterly indifferent light of the stars. And then he looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not a soldier, I saw not a monster, I saw a man, a lonely, broken, and utterly beautiful man. "I don't know," he said, his voice a raw, honest, and utterly devastating whisper. And in that moment, in that one, single, and utterly breathtaking confession of a doubt, of a vulnerability, of a loss of control, the final, beautiful, and utterly terrifying wall between us crumbled to dust. And I knew, with a sudden, soul-shattering certainty, that I was no longer just his prisoner. I was his accomplice, his confidant, his equal. And that, I was beginning to realize, was a more dangerous, more seductive, and infinitely more intoxicating role than I had ever imagined. Chapter 18, Killian. I don't know. The words were a betrayal, a catastrophic failure of discipline, a confession of weakness so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical wound. I was a man defined by his certainty, by his control, by his unwavering, unshakable knowledge of the mission. And in a single, unguarded moment, under the vast, empty, and strangely intimate gaze of a million indifferent stars, I had confessed to the one, single, and utterly unforgivable sin in my world. I was lost. She did not mock me. She did not press her advantage. She simply stood there, a small, silent, and strangely comforting presence in the vast empty darkness of the night. And she looked at me, and in her beautiful, intelligent, and now shockingly clear blue eyes, I saw not a victim, I saw not a pawn, I saw a woman who had seen the monster behind the mask, and who had not. To my eternal, soul-shattering surprise. Run away. The confession had changed the landscape between us, the carefully constructed artifice of our relationship. The intricate, deadly game of manipulation and resistance had been stripped away, leaving behind something raw, honest, and infinitely more dangerous. We were no longer just a captor and a captive. We were two lonely, broken souls, adrift in a dark, violent, and utterly unforgiving world. And we had, against all odds, against all reason, against every instinct of self-preservation, found a strange, unexpected, and deeply seductive anchor in each other. The days that followed were a study in a new, fragile, and utterly terrifying intimacy. The silence between us was no longer charged with suspicion and hostility. It was charged with a different kind of tension, a low, humming, and utterly electric current of unspoken desire. I found myself watching her, my gaze a new, raw, and utterly possessive thing. I was no longer just studying her for weaknesses. I was studying her for the sheer, simple, and utterly intoxicating pleasure of looking at her. I watched the way the morning light would catch in the gold of her hair. I watched the way her brow would furrow in concentration when she was reading. I watched the way her lips would curve into a small, almost imperceptible smile when she was listening to music. She was a fever in my blood, a beautiful, addictive, and utterly maddening presence that was slowly, methodically, and expertly dismantling my carefully constructed world. The mission, the cold, hard, and utterly logical reason for my presence in her life was a distant, fading echo, a ghost of a former life that no longer seemed to have any relevance, any meaning, any power over me. My obsession was no longer with finding the senator's sin. It was with her. I was losing control, and the most terrifying part of it was, I no longer cared. One night, we were in the library. A fire was roaring in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on the room. She was at the piano, her fingers moving over the keys with a new, fluid, and utterly captivating grace. She was playing a piece I did not recognize, a dark, stormy, and breathtakingly beautiful melody that was full of a longing, a passion, and a profound, heartbreaking sadness. I was standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in my hand, and I was watching her. And as I listened to the music, as I watched the way her body swayed with the rhythm, the way her eyes closed in a moment of pure, unadulterated ecstasy, I felt a surge of a raw, possessive, and utterly overwhelming desire. I wanted her, not just her body. I wanted her soul. I wanted to be the one who made her play like that. I wanted to be the one who made her feel like that. I wanted to be the one who could both break her and put her back together again. I walked to the piano. I did not stop her. I simply stood behind her, my hand resting on the cool, smooth wood of the instrument. She did not falter. She did not stop. She simply continued to play, her music a silken, seductive, and utterly intoxicating invitation, when the final, beautiful, and heartbreaking chord faded into silence. She did not move. She simply sat there, her back to me, her shoulders rising and falling with the gentle, rhythmic cadence of her breath. The silence that followed was a living, breathing thing, thick with 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 unfulfilled desires. I reached out, and with a slow, deliberate, and almost reverent touch, I ran a single, long, elegant finger down the delicate, beautiful, and utterly vulnerable line of her spine. She shivered at my touch, a small, involuntary, and utterly devastating surrender. She turned to look at me then, her face tilted up to mine, her eyes, those beautiful, intelligent, and now dark, stormy pools of desire, holding mine with a new, raw, and utterly breathtaking honesty. "What do you want from me, Killian?" she whispered, her voice a raw, honest, and utterly devastating thing. The lie was on the tip of my tongue, the easy, practiced deception that had been my shield, my weapon, my very skin. For as long as I could remember, "I want your father's secret," but I could not say it. Not to her. Not now. "I want everything," I said, my own voice a raw, honest, and utterly possessive whisper, and then I kissed her. It was not the desperate, violent, and almost angry kiss of the study. It was something else, something slower, something deeper, something more dangerous. It was a slow, deliberate, and utterly intoxicating claiming, a silent, unbreakable vow, a promise of a beautiful, exquisite, and utterly devastating ruin. She kissed me back, her own desperation matching mine, a raw, hungry need for the darkness, the danger, the beautiful, brutal reality of me. She clung to me, her body arching against his, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, deeper. This was not a game. This was not a strategy. This was something else, something raw, something real, something terrifying. And in the heart of the silence, in the crucible of our shared loneliness and our shared desire, we had finally, irrevocably, and utterly surrendered to the beautiful, destructive, and utterly intoxicating music of our own dark, twisted, and utterly inescapable souls. Chapter 19, Seraphina. The kiss was not a surrender, it was a conflagration. It was the moment a single, stray spark, nurtured in the dry, tinderbox of our shared isolation, finally met the gasoline of our suppressed desires. The world went up in flames. Reason, fear, self-preservation, it all turned to ash in the face of a heat so intense, so absolute. It felt like the sun had been born between us. His mouth was a study in contradictions. It was firm and demanding, yet impossibly soft. It was the mouth of a liar and a killer, yet it tasted of a truth so profound it made my soul ache. It was a kiss of ruin and of salvation, and I was drowning in it, a willing, eager victim of a beautiful, perfect storm. I was a scholar of history, a student of dead languages and forgotten empires. I understood the world through texts and theories, but this was a language I had never learned, a history that was being written on my skin, in my blood, in the frantic, desperate beating of my own heart. It was a raw, primal, and utterly undeniable knowledge that bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the soul. He was a monster. I knew that. I had seen the evidence of it. The cold, casual brutality with which he moved through the world, but in his arms, in the circle of his embrace. He was not a monster. He was a man of exquisite, breathtaking contradictions. A man who could kill with the same hands that could trace the delicate line of my jaw with a touch so gentle it made me want to weep. He lifted me from the piano bench as if I weighed nothing, his mouth never leaving mine. He carried me through the silent, sleeping house to his room, a stark, minimalist space of charcoal grays and blacks that was a reflection of the man himself. He laid me on his bed. The cool, crisp sheets, a shocking contrast to the fire that was burning between us. And then he showed me the other side of the storm. It was not a gentle, tender lovemaking. It was a raw, brutal, and beautiful thing, a desperate, frantic claiming. It was a fusion of two souls, a forging of a new, unbreakable, and utterly terrifying bond. It was a conversation without words, a story told in the language of skin against skin, of breath against breath, of two broken people finding a strange, violent, and utterly perfect kind of wholeness in each other's arms, in the aftermath. As we lay tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, the first pale light of dawn creeping through the vast, uncurtained window. I turned to look at him. His face, in the soft, gray light, was unguarded. His eyes, those stormy, beautiful, and utterly unreadable eyes, were holding mine with a new, raw intensity. "This changes nothing," I whispered. The words a lie, a desperate, foolish attempt to cling to the wreckage of my old life. He simply smiled, a small, devastatingly beautiful curve of his lips. "It changes everything," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through me, a promise and a threat in one. And I knew, with a terrifying, soul-shattering certainty, that he was right. The game had changed, the rules had been rewritten, and we were both, irrevocably and utterly, lost. Chapter 20, Killian. The morning after was a study in a new kind of silence. It was not the cold, hostile silence of before. It was a heavy, charged, and utterly terrifying silence, thick with the unspoken consequences of our actions. I had crossed a line. I had not just breached the protocol. I had incinerated it. I had touched the target. I had claimed her. And in doing so, I had signed my own death warrant. I watched her sleep, her face a mask of a peace I knew was a fragile, temporary thing. The storm had passed, but the wreckage remained. And I, the man who had been sent to exploit her, to use her, to break her, had instead, in a moment of a beautiful, terrible, and utterly unforgivable weakness, become her protector, her lover, her something else, something I did not have a name for. The call from Silvio Moretti came at dawn, a sharp, angry summons that was a brutal, unwelcome intrusion into the quiet, fragile world we had created in the darkness. Report. He had snarled, his voice a gravelly, impatient thing on the other end of the line. I had given him the sanitized version. The senator was grieving. The daughter was a mess. The leverage was close. It was a lie. Of course. A beautiful, intricate, and utterly damning lie. And it was a lie that I knew, with a cold, hard certainty, would eventually cost me my life. I ended the call and stood there, the phone a cold, heavy weight in my hand, the silence of the house a crushing, suffocating thing. The mission was a ghost, a distant, fading echo of a life that was no longer mine. My only mission now was her. I went back to the room. She was awake. Her eyes, those beautiful, intelligent, and now shockingly vulnerable blue eyes, watching me from the tangle of the sheets. She was not a target. She was not a pawn. She was a woman. My woman. And I would burn the world to the ground to keep her safe. I walked to the bed and sat on the edge, my back to her. I could feel her gaze on me, a physical thing, a question she was too afraid, or too proud, to ask. He called. I said, my voice a quiet, toneless thing. He wants the leverage. He wants your father. I felt her stiffen beside me, the fragile, post-coital peace between us shattering into a million tiny, glittering pieces. "And what did you tell him?" she asked, her voice a small, tight, and utterly terrified thing. I turned to look at her then, my own gaze a steady, unwavering, and utterly honest thing. I told him I was working on it. I said, and then I told her the truth. The real truth. The one that would either bind us together or tear us apart forever. I lied. She stared at me, her eyes wide with 100 unasked questions. And in that moment, in the beautiful, terrible, and utterly honest silence of the morning after, I knew that our story, the real story, the one that was not about lies and manipulation, but about a fragile, dangerous, and utterly consuming love, had just begun. The silence in the penthouse after the kiss was a physical entity. It was heavier than the unsaid words, thicker than the tension that crackled in the air between them. It clung to the plush furniture and seeped into the very walls of Seraphina's gilded cage, transforming it from a fortress into a tomb of forbidden moments. Killian had retreated so far into himself he was practically a ghost. He moved with a chilling, spectral grace, his presence a constant, throbbing reminder of the line he had crossed and then viciously redrawn. For Seraphina, the whiplash was a form of exquisite torture. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his lips, the desperate bruising force of his hands on her body. It was a memory branded into her skin, a confusing cocktail of fear and an intoxicating, dangerous desire. But the man who now occupied her space was a stranger. His slate-gray eyes, once turbulent with a storm she'd felt privileged to witness, were now polished stones, reflecting nothing. They looked through her, past her, as if she were just another piece of the expensive decor. His voice, when he used it, was clipped, impersonal, and stripped of all warmth. He was her guardian, her protector, nothing more. The abruptness of his withdrawal hurt more than his previous coldness ever could. It was a rejection that felt deeply personal. It planted a seed of doubt that flowered into a garden of insecurities. Why kiss her with such raw, unrestrained hunger only to treat her like she didn't exist? Was it a moment of weakness, a simple lapse in his formidable control? Or was it something else entirely, a calculated move in a game whose rules she didn't understand? She told herself to be angry. She told herself to fear him. Part of her did, but another, more reckless part, the part that had felt truly alive for the first time in his arms, longed to see that crack in his armor again. She wanted to provoke the storm, to force a reaction. Anything to prove that the man who had kissed her was still in there somewhere, buried beneath layers of ice and duty. For Killian, every waking moment was a self-inflicted punishment. The kiss had been a catastrophic failure of discipline, a betrayal of the code that had kept him alive in a world that devoured the weak. He was an instrument of the Moretti family, a weapon honed for a single purpose. Weapons didn't feel, they didn't hesitate, and they certainly didn't fall for the target. He had to repeat the mantra in his head, a litany against the encroaching weakness she represented. She is the mission. She is a means to an end. He would look at her, see the confusion and hurt swimming in the depths of her sapphire eyes, and force himself to see the senator instead. Senator Hayes, the self-righteous hypocrite, the obstacle in Silvio Moretti's path. Seraphina was just collateral, a beautiful, spirited, maddening piece of collateral. But the lie was becoming harder to swallow. The taste of her was still on his tongue, and the memory of her soft gasp against his lips was a phantom echo that haunted the silence. He had felt her tremble, and it had undone him in a way no bullet or blade ever could. The pressure from Silvio Moretti was mounting. The old man's patience was notoriously thin, and Killian had been on this assignment for weeks, with nothing to show for it but a breach of protocol. He needed leverage, and he needed it now. The clock was ticking, and failure was not an option in Moretti's world. Failure meant a shallow grave. He knew he had to return to the original plan manipulation, but his approach had to change. The kiss, his moment of greatest weakness, would have to be repurposed. It would become his most effective tool. He would not use intimidation or fear. He would use the very vulnerability he had revealed. Turning his mistake into a calculated strategy, he would exploit the emotional intimacy he had accidentally created. He chose his moment carefully. A few nights later, as a relentless autumn rain lashed against the panoramic windows, he found her curled on the sofa, staring out at the blurred, glittering tapestry of the city below. She looked achingly small in the vast, empty space, a lost princess in her lonely tower. The scene twisted something sharp and unfamiliar in his gut. He ignored it. He approached without a sound, his footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian rug. He didn't sit, but stood behind the sofa. A tall, imposing shadow cloaked in darkness, the faint scent of his cologne sandalwood and something metallic, like cold steel, drifted over her. "You should sleep," he said. His voice was a low murmur, softer than it had been in days, but still devoid of any real warmth. Seraphina flinched but didn't turn. "I'm not tired. Staring at the rain won't solve anything." "And what would you know about my problems?" she retorted, her voice laced with a bitterness she couldn't hide. He remained silent for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air. This was the opening. "I know what it feels like to be trapped," he said, the admission quiet and unexpected. That made her turn. Her eyes searched his face in the dim light, looking for a sign of deception. His expression was impassive, a mask of stone, but his voice had held a flicker of something genuine, or so she wanted to believe. "You have no idea what my life is like," she said, her tone softening slightly. "No," he conceded. "I don't. But I know what it's like to live a life that isn't your own, to have your choices made for you, to wear a mask every single day." He was walking a razor's edge. He was weaving a fiction from the threads of his own grim reality, tailoring it for her. He was giving her a piece of himself, a fabricated, carefully curated piece to earn her trust. "The other night," he began, his voice dropping even lower. He watched as she instinctively touched her lips, a gesture so subtle he almost missed it. That was a lapse in judgment, unprofessional. It won't happen again. He wasn't apologizing for the kiss. He was apologizing for being human. It was a far more disarming tactic. Seraphina hugged a velvet cushion to her chest. "Why did you do it?" "Killian," he held her gaze. "Because, for a moment, I forgot who I was. I saw you, and I forgot the mask." It was the most profound truth he could offer her, wrapped in the context of a lie. He saw the conflict in her eyes. The cautious, intelligent woman in her was screaming warnings, but the lonely, emotionally starved girl was captivated. He had offered her a glimpse behind the curtain, and she was desperate to see more. "Who are you?" Then she whispered. He finally moved, circling the sofa to sit in the armchair opposite her. maintaining a professional distance but creating a new, more dangerous kind of proximity. The conversation was now an intimate circle in the vast darkness. "I'm a man who was taught that emotions are a liability," he said, the lie flowing easily. He built his story piece by piece, a tragic mosaic of a harsh upbringing, of a family that demanded perfection and punished weakness. He spoke of a life spent in the shadows, protecting others, never having a life of his own. He painted a portrait of a man so disciplined, so controlled, that a single moment of genuine feeling had shattered his composure. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, because every word was an echo of a truth he could never tell her. He watched her listen, her expression softening, her guard slowly, almost imperceptibly, lowering. She was starting to see him not as her jailer, but as a fellow prisoner. "My father. He's like that too," she confided, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "He believes any emotion is a vulnerability to be exploited. He built his entire career on being unbreachable." Killian's senses sharpened. This was it. The path was opening. "That must be a heavy burden to place on a family," he said, his tone one of detached empathy. He was a confessor, drawing out her sins. "You have no idea." She laughed, a brittle, humorless sound. "Everything is about his image, his career, the great Senator Hayes, the man who cleaned up the city. Sometimes I think he loves the idea of his family more than the people in it." The resentment in her voice was a raw, open wound. Killian leaned forward slightly, his posture conveying intense interest. "Cleaned up the city. He was the district attorney before he was a senator." "Correct, for years," she confirmed, pulling her knees to her chest. "He was relentless, obsessed. That's when he made his name. There was one case. It almost broke him. The Falcone case." The name landed in the room like a stone. Killian kept his expression neutral, but inside, his pulse quickened. He had a thread. "He never talks about it." Sarah continued, lost in the memory, "But my mother used to say he was a different man after it was over. Harder, colder. He used to have this fire in him for justice. After that, it felt more like ambition." She looked up at him, her eyes searching for understanding. "He won. Of course, sent Rico Falcone away for life. It's what launched his political career. But I always felt like he lost something important to do it. Sometimes. To fight monsters. You have to become one yourself," Killian offered, the words tasting like acid in his mouth. "Maybe," she whispered, looking away again. "Or maybe the monster was there all along." They sat in silence for a while after that. The confession had exhausted her. For Killian, it was a jolt of pure adrenaline. The Falcone case. He had what he needed. Later that night, long after Seraphina had retreated to her bedroom, Killian sat in the darkened living room, his laptop casting a pale, ghostly light on his face. The city outside was quiet, sleeping under a blanket of rain. His world, however, was wide awake. He was a ghost in the machine now, his fingers flying across the keyboard with silent, deadly efficiency. He moved through firewalls and encrypted servers with the ease of a man walking through his own home. The Moretti family had resources, backdoors into systems that the public never knew existed. He accessed archived police records, court transcripts, and old newspaper articles. The official story of the Rico Falcone case was public record. Falcone was a brutal mob boss who had run the city's underworld for a decade. DA Martin Hayes was the David who had slain Goliath, a fearless prosecutor who succeeded where everyone else had failed. The key to the conviction was the testimony of a single star witness, a low-level bookie named Vinnie Gallo, and a murder weapon, a .38 caliber revolver, found in Falcone's possession. But as Killian dug deeper, peeling back the layers of the official narrative, he found inconsistencies, whispers, redactions. Vinnie Gallo had disappeared into witness protection immediately after the trial and was rumored to have died of a heart attack 6 months later. Convenient. He cross-referenced financial records, searching for anomalies around the time of the trial, and then he found it. A shell corporation, linked to a law firm that had done pro bono work for the DA's office, had made a series of large, untraceable payments to an offshore account in the name of Gallo's wife. It was a lead, but it wasn't proof. He needed more for the next 2 nights. He barely slept. During the day, he was the perfect bodyguard, watchful and silent. He played his part, engaging Seraphina in quiet conversation, slowly drawing more from her. He asked about her mother, about her childhood, about the pressures of being a politician's daughter. Each conversation was a delicate excavation, and she, hungry for connection, gave him the tools to dig. She told him about her father's late nights, his paranoia, the way he would sometimes talk in his sleep, muttering names and phrases she didn't understand. She mentioned a retired detective, a man named O'Malley, her father's old partner and friend, the one man he still trusted implicitly. The name was another key. Killian accessed O'Malley's sealed service record. The man had retired with a full pension and a commendation for his work on the Falcone case. He now lived a quiet life in Florida. Too quiet. Killian made a call. He spoke in clipped, fluent Italian to a Moretti contact in Miami. He didn't ask for violence. He just asked for a conversation, a little leverage to be applied, an old gambling debt, a wayward grandchild. Everyone had a weakness. 48 hours later, a digitized audio file appeared in his secure inbox. It was a recording of a terrified old man speaking to a very persuasive Moretti associate. It was O'Malley, and he was confessing everything. Killian put on his headphones, the penthouse silent around him. He pressed play. O'Malley's voice was thin and reedy, cracking with the fear of a man whose comfortable lies were being ripped away. He told the story. Rico Falcone was guilty. Everyone knew he was guilty, but their case was circumstantial, falling apart. The jury was going to acquit. Martin Hayes's career would be over before it began, so Hayes made a choice. He decided to tip the scales. He and O'Malley took a gun from an old, unsolved case out of the evidence locker, a clean gun. O'Malley, under direct orders from Hayes, planted it in the trunk of Falcone's car during a search. It was the murder weapon from a different crime, but it was untraceable, and it fit the narrative. Then they leaned on Vinnie Gallo. They didn't just offer him money and protection. They threatened to pin a separate crime on his son. They manufactured his testimony, feeding him details only the police could know. They framed a guilty man. They broke the law to uphold it. The senator's sin. It was perfect. It was a bomb that would not only end Senator Hayes's career, but would obliterate his entire legacy. The champion of law and order, the man who built his life on a pedestal of integrity, was a criminal. Silvio Moretti wouldn't just control the senator, he would own him, body and soul. Killian closed the laptop. The mission was complete. He had succeeded. A cold sense of triumph should have washed over him. He should have felt the satisfaction of a job well done, the relief of knowing he had averted Moretti's wrath. But he felt nothing, just a vast, hollow emptiness. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling, indifferent city. He thought of the conversation he'd had with Seraphina just that morning. She had been talking about her volunteer work at a children's library, her face animated, her eyes bright with a passion that had nothing to do with her father's world. He saw her, in that moment, not as a target, not as collateral, but simply as a woman with a life and a heart that were hers and hers alone. He now held the weapon that would destroy her. Using this information wouldn't just ruin her father, it would shatter Seraphina's world, her entire life, her identity, her belief in the one man she was supposed to be able to trust would be reduced to ashes. The betrayal would break her in a way that no physical threat ever could. And he, Killian Black, would be the one to light the match. He was caught in a trap of his own making. To betray Moretti was to sign his own death warrant. The family's reach was absolute, its memory eternal. There was no running, no hiding. But to complete his mission, to hand this information over to Silvio Moretti, felt like a different kind of death. It meant destroying the one person who had managed to breach the impenetrable walls around his soul. It meant killing the part of himself that had stirred to life in her presence. He stood there for a long time, the damning audio file on his laptop a ticking time bomb in the silent room. He was trapped between loyalty and something he was terrified to name. He had to make a choice, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that either path led straight to hell. The hours following Killian's discovery bled into a day, then two, marked by a suffocating, static tension. He was a man possessed by a ghost, haunted by the digital specter of O'Malley's confession that lay dormant in his laptop. The file was a singularity, a point of infinite density that warped the time and space around him. He had the weapon. The mission was, for all intents and purposes, complete. All that remained was to pull the trigger to send one encrypted file to one recipient, an act that required no more than a few keystrokes. Yet, his fingers remained paralyzed each time he opened the secure messaging client, his screen illuminated by the cold, impersonal glow of the interface. He would see Seraphina's face in his mind, not the defiant, guarded woman he'd first met, but the woman who had laughed while describing a funny passage from a book, her eyes crinkling at the corners. The woman who had confided in him, her voice a soft murmur in the rainy darkness. The woman he had kissed, whose trembling response had short-circuited every defense mechanism he owned. To send the file was to extinguish that light, to condemn her to a life built on the ashes of her father's legacy. It was an act of cruelty so profound it felt like a physical violation. So he did nothing. He stalled. He told himself he was double-checking the data, ensuring there were no loose ends, no way for the information to be traced back to him. It was a lie he fed himself to justify his hesitation. In reality, he was buying time he didn't have. Adrift in a purgatory of his own making, his inertia manifested as a dangerous, volatile energy. He became a caged panther, pacing the confines of the penthouse, his silence more menacing than any threat. The cold, professional mask was gone, replaced by a raw, brooding intensity that vibrated in the air around him. He would stop and stare out the window for an hour without moving, lost in a battle only he could see. At other times, a dropped glass or a sudden noise would make him spin, his hand instinctively moving to the small of his back, his eyes wild and lethal for a split second before the mask of control slammed back into place. Seraphina watched him, and a new kind of fear, colder and more intelligent than before, began to take root. His behavior no longer felt like the aftermath of a forbidden kiss. This was something deeper, something darker. The man who had meticulously constructed a story of a controlled, emotionless past was now a walking paradox, a storm of unchecked turmoil barely contained within a human form. The seeds of suspicion, planted by his whiplash behavior, began to sprout. She was the daughter of a master politician, raised in a world of calculated words and hidden agendas. She'd been taught from a young age to read the subtle currents beneath the surface of a conversation, to spot the tells in a carefully constructed facade. And Killian's facade was beginning to crumble. His story, which had so captivated her lonely heart, now replayed in her mind with a dissonant quality. It was too neat, too perfectly tragic, too tailored to elicit the exact sympathy she had given. It felt less like a confession and more like a script. She started to watch him not as a woman trying to understand the man who'd captivated her, but as an analyst studying an anomaly. She catalogued his movements, his habits, the way his eyes would sweep a room, not for her safety, but as if assessing angles and exits. He was her guardian. Yes, but the intensity of his vigilance felt proprietary, as if he wasn't protecting her from a threat, but guarding an asset. The first concrete clue came from a moment of pure carelessness, born of his distraction. He kept two phones. One was a standard, high-end smartphone for superficial communications. The other was a burner, a simple, featureless device he used for calls that were always short and conducted in low, clipped tones. One afternoon, he had just finished one such call and placed the burner on the marble kitchen island, his back to her as he got a glass of water. For a split second, the screen lit up with an incoming text message. Her eyes, drawn to the sudden light, caught two things before the screen went dark: a single name, Silvio, and the first two words of the message preview report, now. The name meant nothing to her on its own, but the tone of the message, a command, not a request lodged in her mind. Killian was not a man who took commands. He was the one who gave them. The brief glimpse was a crack in the monolith of his authority, a hint that he, too, served a master. That night, she couldn't sleep. The name Silvio echoed in her thoughts. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing, connecting disparate, seemingly unconnected dots. The initial, vague threats against her father. Killian's sudden, high-security appointment. His complete control over her life. His probing questions about her father's past, specifically his career as a prosecutor. The pieces were a jumble, a puzzle she couldn't yet assemble, but she could feel their shape. She needed to know more, but how her laptop, her phone, her entire digital life was monitored. He had made that perfectly clear. Any search she conducted would be flagged instantly. She was a prisoner in her own home, and her jailer was the one man she needed to investigate. The opportunity came a few days later, disguised as an act of mercy. She had been complaining of cabin fever, of feeling the walls closing in, To her surprise, Killian agreed to an outing, not to a cafe or a park, but to a public library a few blocks away. It was a secure, easily controlled environment. 1 hour, he had said, his voice flat. You browse for books. I'll be within 10 feet of you at all times. You don't speak to anyone. You don't use any public terminals. Understood, understood, she'd replied, her heart hammering with a plan that was both terrifying and necessary. The library was an oasis of quiet normalcy. The scent of old paper and wood polish filled the air. For a moment, she almost forgot her mission, seduced by the rows of books that promised escape. Killian was a shadow at her back, his presence a cold weight. He followed her through the stacks, his eyes constantly scanning. She led him to a quiet, secluded section on art history. While pretending to browse the oversized, heavy books, she executed her plan. Months ago, long before the threats began, she had purchased a mini tablet, a cheap disposable device she kept in her oversized purse for emergencies. A habit born from a lifetime of being a person of interest. It had its own cellular connection, paid for with cash. She had never used it, with her body shielding her movements from Killian. She slid the tablet from her purse, her fingers trembling slightly. Type the name into the search engine, Silvio. Organized crime, city. The result was instantaneous. The first entry was a detailed article on the city's most notorious and elusive crime boss, a man whose empire was built in the shadows, whose influence was said to reach into the highest echelons of power. A man named Silvio Moretti. Seraphina felt the blood drain from her face. Moretti. The name was infamous. It was the boogeyman from her father's stories, the embodiment of the criminal element he had dedicated his life to fighting. The Moretti crime family was the reason she was in this gilded cage in the first place. Her bodyguard, the man who was supposed to be protecting her from the Morettis, was taking commands from their leader. The entire world tilted on its axis. The threats, his arrival, his control, the kiss, the questions. It all snapped into a horrifying, crystal-clear focus. It wasn't protection. It was an infiltration. He wasn't her shield. He was the Trojan horse, wheeled past the gates of her life. He was here to get to her father. And she had been his primary tool. The thought was so violating it made her physically sick. She leaned against the bookshelf, the spine of a heavy art book digging into her back, grounding her. She quickly closed the search, her mind a maelstrom of betrayal and fear. She had to remain calm. She couldn't let him see. She took a deep breath, selected a book on Renaissance painters at random, and turned to face him. "I'm ready to go," she said, her voice a carefully constructed imitation of normalcy. If Killian noticed her pallor or the tremor in her hands, he gave no sign. He simply nodded and escorted her out. Back in the penthouse, the silence was no longer just tense, it was poisoned. She now saw everything through a new lens. Every watchful glance wasn't protective, it was possessive. Every quiet question wasn't conversation, it was interrogation. She was living with the enemy, and he didn't even know he'd been discovered. She needed proof. Concrete, undeniable proof. A name on a search engine wasn't enough. She had to get into his devices. For the next 2 days, she played the part of the compliant charge, a mouse pretending it was unaware of the hawk circling overhead. She observed his routines with a new, feverish intensity. She noted where he charged his phones, where he left his laptop. She watched him type passwords, trying to catch a glimpse of the characters, the muscle memory of his fingers. He was a creature of habit, obsessively disciplined, but he was also distracted, consumed by his own internal war. That was her only advantage. The summons she had been praying for came on a Friday night. Killian's burner phone rang. He answered, and even from across the room, she could feel the temperature drop. The conversation was in Italian, a language she didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was an order. He hung up and turned to her, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "I have to go out. An urgent matter." Her heart leaped. "Is everything all right?" she asked, feigning concern. "It will be," he said. His voice clipped. "The building is secure. Every lock is on a remote system that I control. The elevator will not respond to your keycard. Do not try to leave. Do not contact anyone. I'll be back in 2 hours. At most." He left, and the final heavy clank of the deadbolt sliding into place was the starting pistol for the most dangerous race of her life. 2 hours. She flew into action. His personal laptop was on the desk in the small office nook. It was locked. Of course. She typed in a few random guesses: his last name, his supposed birth date. Access denied. She thought back to the story he'd told her. The tragic, fabricated history of his life. He had spoken of a younger sister, lost to illness. He had given her a name, Ilara. He had said it with a flicker of something that, at the time, she had thought was real pain. Now, she knew it was just another part of the performance. But even manipulators draw from some well of truth. She typed the name, Elara. Then, a combination of numbers. The year he'd said she died. Ilara 1998. Access granted. A wave of nausea and triumph washed over her. He had used the centerpiece of his emotional manipulation as his password. The irony was sickening. The desktop was clean, organized with military precision. There were folders for schematics of the building, security protocols, communication logs. She ignored them all. Her intuition guided her to a folder simply labeled Project Nightingale. The code name was almost poetic in its cruelty. She was the songbird in the cage. She opened it. Inside were dozens of files, surveillance logs of her movements, a detailed psychological profile that made her skin crawl, outlining her weaknesses, her emotional triggers, her relationship with her father. It was a blueprint of her soul, written by a predator. And then she saw it. A subfolder labeled Leverage. Her hand trembled as she double-clicked. It contained files on the Falcone case, news clippings, court documents, and one single audio file. O'Malley Park Confession.mp3. She stared at the name, her blood running cold. O'Malley, her father's oldest friend, Uncle Fitz. He'd told her to call him as a child, a kindly man who smelled of peppermint and old books, with a sense of dread so profound it felt like she was falling. She put on Killian's headphones, which lay next to the laptop, and pressed play. The terrified, reedy voice of Fitz O'Malley filled her ears. He spoke of evidence lockers, of untraceable guns, of coercing a witness. He spoke of her father, Martin Hayes, not as a champion of justice, but as a desperate, ambitious man willing to break the very law he had sworn to uphold. He confessed to a crime that had been the bedrock of her father's entire career, the foundation of their family's life and honor. Every word was a hammer blow, systematically shattering the world she had known. Her father, the paragon of integrity, was a fraud. Her life, her privilege, her very name all built on a lie. The recording ended, but the silence that followed was louder than any scream. She sat there, frozen, the headphones still pressed against her ears, as the pieces of her reality crumbled around her. And in the middle of the ruins, one truth stood undeniable and horrific: the man she had begun to fall for. The man whose kiss had awakened her. Was the architect of this destruction. He hadn't just been sent to find a weakness. He was the weakness. A poison injected directly into her life. She didn't know how long she sat there, adrift in a sea of shock and betrayal. It was the soft electronic chime of the elevator arriving on their floor that snapped her back to the present. He was back. She didn't close the laptop. She didn't move. She simply took off the headphones and placed them on the desk. She clicked the audio file one more time, setting the volume just loud enough to be heard in the silent apartment. O'Malley's terrified confession began to spill into the room, a ghostly testament to decades of deceit. Killian entered, his large frame filling the doorway. He saw her sitting there, saw the laptop, and heard the voice from the speakers. He froze, for a split second. She saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, not surprise, but a look of bleak, profound resignation. As if this was an outcome he had always known was inevitable. The unveiling was at hand. He slowly closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing like a gunshot in the charged silence. He didn't speak. He just walked towards her, his movements weary, the predatory grace replaced by the heavy tread of a condemned man. She finally looked at him, and the face she saw was that of a stranger. The mask was gone. There was no cold professional, no tortured soul. There was just a man, stripped bare by the truth. "He called you Uncle Fitz," she said, her voice a dead, hollow thing. "You made Uncle Fitz betray him." O'Malley's voice continued to babble from the speakers, a soundtrack to their reckoning. Killian reached the desk and, with a quiet finality, closed the laptop, cutting the confession short. "Seraphina," he began, his voice rough. "Don't!" she snapped, flinching as if his voice were a physical blow. She stood up, her body trembling with a rage so cold it felt like ice in her veins. "Don't you dare say my name." How much of it was a lie? Killian, was any of it real? Your story? Your family? Alara, when he didn't answer, just stared at her with those haunted slate-gray eyes. She knew. All of it. She whispered. The realization a fresh wave of agony. Every word was a tool. Every shared moment was an interrogation. That kiss. Her voice broke. What was that? Just another way to get me to talk. "No," he said, and the single word was raw, torn from him. "Liar," she screamed, the sound ripping from her throat. "You are a liar. You work for Silvio Moretti. You came into my home, into my life, under the pretense of protecting me, and all you've done is build a cage and sharpen a knife to gut my family with." He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Yes. The simple, unadorned confession was more devastating than any defense. "Your mission was to find leverage against my father," she continued, pacing now, her energy frantic, desperate. "And you found it. This is it. Congratulations. So what's next? You send that file to your boss, and he owns my father forever. Is that the plan?" "I haven't sent it?" he said quietly. She stopped and stared at him, a bitter, incredulous laugh escaping her lips. "Oh, you haven't sent it. You want a medal. For hesitating. You still did it. You found it. You packaged it. You put the bow on top. The only thing you haven't done is put it in the mail. That doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you a coward." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. He visibly recoiled. "You've been sitting on this, haven't you?" She pressed on, her voice dripping with scorn. "Watching me, talking to me, letting me believe. What, that you were different, that you cared, all while holding the bomb that would blow up my entire world." "It's not that simple," he ground out, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "It is exactly that simple," she cried, tears of rage and betrayal finally streaming down her face. "You serve a monster, which makes you a monster. You were sent to destroy my father, and you used me to do it. The trust I gave you, the things I told you, you twisted it all into a weapon." She stood directly in front of him now, close enough to see the torment churning in his eyes. For the first time, she saw the full depth of the conflict he was in. She saw the man trapped between a lifetime of brutal loyalty and a feeling he couldn't afford to have. But seeing it didn't bring her comfort. It only deepened the wound. He had felt something for her, she realized, and he had still chosen to move forward with his mission. He had still chosen to destroy her. "I am your weakness, aren't I?" she said, the words cold and precise. "That's what your profile of me says. Emotional, trusting, a potential weakness. But it turns out I'm yours, too. That's why you hesitated." He didn't answer. He just looked at her, his expression a ruin of guilt and despair. "The tragedy," she whispered, her voice breaking with the sheer weight of it all, "is that it doesn't matter. You've already made your choice. The moment you walked into my life, the war was over. You just hadn't fired the last shot." She backed away from him, a deep, shuddering breath racking her body. The betrayal was absolute, a chasm that had opened up between them, swallowing everything that had passed every shared glance, every quiet conversation, every forbidden touch. He was her protector, her confidant, her captor, and her executioner, all wrapped into one devastating package, and the world he had just revealed to her was one where she could trust no one, least of all herself. The aftermath of the unveiling was not a fiery explosion, but a cold, silent implosion. The penthouse, once a space defined by a tense, simmering proximity, became a vacuum. The truth, now exposed, had sucked all the air out of their world, leaving behind a wasteland of betrayal and shattered illusions. They were two celestial bodies that had collided, and now they were just drifting wreckage, trapped in the same dead orbit. For Seraphina, the rage that had sustained her during the confrontation collapsed into a profound, hollow grief. She retreated to her bedroom, the one space that still felt marginally hers, and locked the door, a futile gesture in a prison where the jailer controlled every mechanism. She didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. A tectonic shift in the foundation of her soul. Her father, the pillar of her world, was a fraud. Killian, the man who had inexplicably breached her defenses, was a monster. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The rage, when it returned, was a different entity. It was colder, sharper, honed by the chilling clarity of her situation. She was trapped. She couldn't call her father. Killian monitored every communication, even if she could. What would she say? The man you hired to protect me from the Morettis works for the Morettis, and he has proof that you built your entire career on a crime. Exposing Killian meant exposing her father, triggering the very implosion the mafia had engineered. Killian had built the perfect prison. He hadn't just confined her body. He had shackled her choices. Any move she made would lead to ruin. She was a queen in checkmate, with a single, useless move left on the board. For Killian. The quiet on the other side of her door was more damning than her screams had been. He had stood in the living room for an hour after she'd left, unmoving, the silence ringing with her final, devastating words. It just makes you a coward. She was right. He had stalled, not out of mercy, but out of an inability to reconcile his duty with his desires. He had allowed himself the luxury of indecision, and in doing so, had only prolonged her torment and sealed his own fate. The mask was gone, and the man underneath was a ruin. He was a creature of loyalty without a worthy master, a man of feeling without the right to feel. He did not try her door. He respected the flimsy barrier she had erected between them. Instead, he became a ghost in his own operation. He maintained the security protocols, his fingers moving over keyboards and touch screens with the detached muscle memory of a lifetime of training. He watched the surveillance feeds, his eyes lingering on the closed-circuit image of her bedroom door. He was still her guardian, but the nature of the threat had changed. It was no longer some external force he had to keep out. The threat was him. The threat was the file on his laptop. The threat was the phone call he knew was coming. The first 24 hours passed in this state of Cold War. Food was left on a tray outside her door and was later retrieved, untouched. The silence was a living thing, breathing in the recycled air of the penthouse. Late on the second night, Seraphina emerged. Killian was on the sofa, his laptop open but his eyes staring blankly at the dark city skyline. He hadn't slept. The shadows under his eyes were stark, his jaw tight with tension. He heard the soft click of her door and his head turned. His movements slow, weary. She didn't look like the fiery, defiant woman who had confronted him. Nor did she look broken. She looked cold. Her eyes, cleared of tears and rage, held a frightening, analytical stillness. She had put on a black silk robe, armoring herself in elegance. She walked to the wet bar, her movements deliberate, and poured herself a glass of water. "How does it work?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. She didn't turn to face him. Killian watched her reflection in the dark window. "How does what work?" "The leverage," she said, her tone clinical, as if discussing a business transaction. "You give the file to Moretti. He then, what calls my father, arranges a meeting, sends him a copy with a list of demands." The question was so unexpected, so devoid of the emotion he had been bracing himself for, that it took him a moment to answer. She wasn't asking as a victim. She was asking as a strategist. "A meeting," Killian said, his voice rough from disuse. "Silvio prefers to look a man in the eye when he breaks him. He'd present the evidence. The terms would be simple. The senator would belong to him. Any legislation Moretti wants passed, he gets. Any investigation he wants quashed, it disappears. In return, the secret stays buried, and my father would have no choice but to agree." She finished for him. She took a sip of water. To protect his legacy. To protect his family. She finally turned, her eyes pinning him in place. "To protect me." The unspoken accusation was deafening. You used his love for me against him. Yes, Killian admitted. She gave a small, humorless nod, as if he had just confirmed a minor detail in a complex equation. And what is your role in this? The cleaner. You find the dirt. You deliver it. And you move on to the next job. Is that it? That is the job. And you're good at it, she stated. It wasn't a question. You were perfect. You found every crack. You studied me, learned my history, my fears. You built a whole persona, this tragic, silent soldier. Just for me. The story about your sister, Alara. Was there ever an Alara? The name was a punch to the gut. He looked away from her, back at the city lights. No, he said, the word tasting like ash. Of course not. She whispered, more to herself than to him. Why invent a new lie when an old one will do? She walked closer, stopping on the other side of the large, marble coffee table, maintaining the barrier between them. The thing I can't figure out, Killian, is you. You did all of this, methodically, brilliantly, and then you stopped. You had the prize, right there, but you didn't deliver it. Why was it guilt? A sudden attack of conscience? It doesn't matter, he said, his jaw tight. Oh, I think it does, she pressed, her voice silky and dangerous. I think it's the only thing that matters now. You hesitated. That means you're compromised. Your boss, Silvio. He doesn't seem like the kind of man who tolerates compromised assets. She saw him flinch. She had hit a nerve. She was using her knowledge, the very information he had taught her about his world, against him. You think you understand, he said, his voice a low warning. I understand that you brought a war to my doorstep and now you seem squeamish about the blood, she countered. You put me in this cage, but I think you're in here with me. You're trapped between your orders and… what? Me. The assignment that grew a conscience before he could answer. The shrill electronic chirp of the burner phone cut through the tension. It was on the side table next to him. They both stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. The screen lit up with the name that had started it all, Silvio. Killian's entire body went rigid. This was it. The call he had been dreading. He knew what it was. The time for stalling was over. He looked at Seraphina, her face pale in the dim light. Her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and vindication. Then he answered the phone. Yes, he said, his voice flat. He listened, his expression hardening into a mask of granite. He didn't reply in Italian. He answered in English. A deliberate choice, forcing Seraphina to be a party to his damnation. The voice on the other end was quiet, raspy with age and power, but it crackled with an authority that was absolute. Even through the phone's tiny speaker, Seraphina could feel its malice. You have been quiet, Killian, Silvio Moretti said. It makes me nervous when my investments are quiet. There were complications, Killian replied. His eyes locked on Seraphina. Complications are your specialty. You solve them. That is why you are valuable. I have been patient. My patience is at an end. Do you have what I sent you for? A beat of silence. Killian's knuckles were white where he gripped the phone. I do. Excellent, Moretti rasped. Then the senator will be hearing from me shortly. The information has not been delivered to you, Killian stated. His words precise and cold. Another silence. This one far more dangerous. Explain, Moretti said. The single word laced with ice. I am ensuring the package is secure. that there are no digital trails. It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. Moretti laughed, a dry, rattling sound like stones in a burial urn. Do not play games with me, my boy. I taught you the game. You have been with the girl for weeks. You have grown attached. I have seen this happen before. A good dog gets confused, thinks the sheep is a friend. It is a weakness we must beat out of him. Killian's jaw worked, but he said nothing. So I will make it simple for you. Moretti continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You will deliver the file to me within the hour. Then you will receive a new order regarding the senator. If you fail, if you hesitate, if I sense for one more second that your loyalty is compromised, well, the girl, Seraphina, such a pretty name, she will pay the price for your sentimentality. We will send the senator a piece of her, something small, but something he'll miss. Do you understand me? Killian. I will turn his angel into my message. The threat was not abstract. It was a promise, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had built an empire on such promises. Killian's face was ashen. He was looking at Seraphina, but he was seeing Moretti's men. He was seeing the unimaginable. I understand, Killian said, his voice a choked whisper. 1 hour, Moretti repeated. And Killian, remember who you belong to. The line went dead. Killian slowly lowered the phone. The room was utterly still. He had been given his final, brutal order. Use the leverage, condemn the senator, and return to his life as Moretti's weapon. Or refuse, and condemn Seraphina to a fate worse than death. The choice he had been agonizing over had been stripped of all nuance. It was now a simple, binary equation of horror. He looked at Seraphina. She had heard everything. The blood had drained from her face, but her eyes were defiant, burning with a fire he thought he had extinguished. She knew she was a pawn, a hostage in a war she never asked for. So that's it, she said, her voice shaking but steady. That's the choice. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He walked to the window and stared out, his back to her. His mind was a maelstrom. He saw his life spooling out in front of him, a life given to him by Moretti. The old man had taken him from a gutter, a feral, violent orphan, and forged him into a weapon. He had given him a purpose, a code, a name. Loyalty to the family was the first and only commandment. To betray it was not just a death sentence, it was a negation of his entire existence. He had killed for Moretti, he had tortured for him, he had erased men from existence, cleaned up the messes left by the family's brutal business. He had done it all without question, without remorse. It was who he was. But then he thought of Seraphina. He thought of her reading in the sliver of afternoon sun that hit the sofa. He thought of the fierce intelligence in her eyes when she challenged him. He thought of the vulnerable, sleeping curve of her spine. He thought of her taste, her scent, the feel of her heart hammering against his. She had become the only real thing in his life of shadows. She was the one act of creation in a life dedicated to destruction. Moretti had made a fatal miscalculation by threatening her. He hadn't forced Killian's loyalty. He had clarified it. He had taken Killian's tangled, chaotic feelings for Seraphina and forged them into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. His mission had never been to protect her from the outside world. His true mission, the one his soul had been screaming at him for weeks, was to protect her from him, from his world, from Silvio Moretti. To obey Moretti was to live, but it was to hand her over to be broken, either emotionally by her father's fall or physically by Moretti's sadism. It was an impossible, unbearable future. To defy him was almost certain death, but in that defiance, there was a chance. A slim, desperate, suicidal chance to save her, to get her out, to give her back the life he had stolen. The loyalty that had shaped him was a chain. The woman who had become his only weakness was the key. He turned from the window. The decision was made. The war in his soul was over. He had chosen his side. He looked at Seraphina, and for the first time since the unveiling, he let her see everything, the guilt, the regret, and the terrifying, unyielding resolve that had replaced them. "He thinks he can control me by threatening you," Killian said, his voice low and steady, imbued with a new, chilling authority. "He's wrong. He thinks you're my weakness. He's right." He walked to the coffee table and picked up the burner phone. Seraphina watched, her breath hitched in her throat, not knowing what he was about to do. He held it in his hand for a moment, the umbilical cord that connected him to his old life. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he smashed it against the marble edge of the table. The plastic casing shattered, the screen spiderwebbed, and the battery flew out. He didn't stop. He smashed it again and again, his movements efficient and brutal, until the device was nothing but a pile of black, splintered fragments. He straightened up, breathing heavily, and kicked the remains under the sofa. It was an act of treason. It was a declaration of war. He was no longer Moretti's cleaner. He was a double agent, serving a new, singular purpose. He looked at Seraphina, who was staring at the wreckage of the phone, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, terrifying hope. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer her jailer. He was her only, and most dangerous, ally. "Silvio Moretti gave me an hour," Killian said, his voice cold as the grave. "That's how long we have to disappear before he sends his men to collect his property." He looked directly at her, his gaze intense. "And you, Seraphina, are no longer his property." The final, splintered crunch of the burner phone being ground into the marble floor was the sound of a world ending, and another, far more dangerous one, beginning. The air in the penthouse crackled, thick with the ozone of Killian's treason. He had severed the leash, and in doing so, had unleashed the very monster Silvio Moretti had spent years creating. Seraphina stood frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with the violent, irrevocable shift in her reality. One moment, she was a hostage, a pawn in a game between powerful, evil men. The next, her jailer had declared war on his own king, seemingly for her sake. The hope that bloomed in her chest was a terrifying, fragile thing, surrounded by the thorns of his past deceptions. "1 hour," Killian repeated, his voice cutting through her shock. The weariness was gone, replaced by a lethal, focused energy. He was no longer a man adrift. He was a weapon with a new target. "That's a conservative estimate. Silvio is arrogant, but he isn't stupid. When I don't deliver, and he can't reach me, he'll assume the worst. He'll send a team, not thugs. His best. Their orders will be to retrieve you and leave me in a body bag." His clinical assessment sent a new wave of ice through her veins. This was real. This wasn't a hypothetical threat whispered over a phone line. It was a death sentence, already signed and on its way. He was already moving, his actions economical and precise. He strode to the office nook and ripped the hard drive from his laptop with the brutal efficiency of a field medic performing an amputation. He took a small, powerful magnet from a drawer and ran it over the drive, the soft hiss of data being erased a final, definitive period on his old life. "Go to your room," he commanded, not looking at her. "Change. Black or dark gray clothes, jeans, a sweater. Something you can move in. Comfortable shoes. No heels. No jewelry. Nothing that can reflect light or be easily grabbed. Take your passport and any cash you have. Nothing else. No photos. No keepsakes. Nothing personal. We walk out of here with only what we can carry. You have 5 minutes." She didn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the floor. "Trust you," she whispered, the words tasting like poison and prayer. "You want me to just trust you after everything." He finally stopped and turned to face her, his expression grim. The guilt was still there, a permanent shadow in his eyes, but it was overlaid with a stark, brutal honesty. "No," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "I don't want you to trust me. I haven't earned that. I may never earn it. I want you to trust your own instinct for survival. Right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and men who will do things to you that you cannot imagine, just to prove a point to your father and to me. I am the lesser of two evils. Seraphina, the monster you know. That's all I can offer you." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was presenting a cold, hard, tactical reality, and in that, paradoxically, there was something to hold on to. She looked at the wreckage of the phone, at the destroyed hard drive, at the unyielding resolve in his eyes. He had just thrown away his entire life. People didn't do that on a whim. 5 minutes, she said, her voice tight, and turned, running to her room, the contents of her closet, a collection of designer clothes and elegant fabrics, seemed absurd. Relics from a life that had ceased to exist the moment Fitz O'Malley's voice had spilled from Killian's speakers. She pulled on a pair of dark jeans, a black cashmere sweater, and flat leather boots, as he'd instructed. She took her passport and the few $100s from her purse. She looked around the beautiful, sterile room, her gaze lingering on a silver-framed photo of her with her parents, taken years ago, when their smiles felt real, with a pang of grief for the girl she used to be. She turned her back on it and walked out. Killian was waiting by the door. He had changed into a similar dark outfit. A black tactical pack was slung over one shoulder. He was holding a small, heavy object in his hand, a handgun. He didn't brandish it, but held it with a familiarity that was more terrifying than any threat. He looked at her, his eyes doing a quick, professional sweep. He nodded once. "Good. Let's go." "Go where she asked." Her voice hushed. "You said it yourself. This building is a fortress. The elevator won't work. The doors are locked." "I built the cage," he said, his voice grim. "I also built a back door." He led her not to the main entrance, but through the kitchen to the pantry. He pushed aside a rack of wine bottles, revealing a section of wall that looked identical to the others. He pressed his palm against a specific spot, and with a faint hydraulic hiss, a panel slid open, revealing a dark, narrow space, a service elevator. One not on any of the building's official blueprints. "Silvio taught me to always have an exit strategy," he said, gesturing for her to enter. "The first and last lesson." The elevator was a cramped metal box, barely big enough for two. It descended silently, bypassing the opulent lobby and taking them deep into the sub-basement of the building, into the grimy, concrete guts of the skyscraper. The air grew cold and damp. "Where does this go?" she whispered, the darkness pressing in. "To the parking garage, level 4. A blind spot in the camera coverage. I have a car there. It's clean. Untraceable." The elevator stopped with a soft bump. The doors slid open to reveal a dimly lit, cavernous space filled with the ghosts of parked cars. Killian stepped out first, gun held low but ready, his head on a constant, fluid swivel. He moved with the deadly grace she had first noticed. But now it wasn't a source of intimidation. It was her only shield. He led her through the rows of cars to a nondescript black sedan. "Get in. Stay low," he ordered. She slid into the passenger seat, her heart pounding against her ribs. He got in beside her, and the engine started with a quiet, powerful hum. He didn't turn on the lights until they were heading up the ramp. They emerged into the rain-slicked city streets. Just another anonymous car disappearing into the river of night traffic. For 10 minutes. They drove in silence. Killian's eyes were never still, constantly checking the mirrors, side streets, his focus absolute. Seraphina watched the familiar city lights blur past the window, feeling like a refugee in her own hometown. "Running won't work," she said finally, breaking the silence. "You know that, don't you? They'll find us." "Moretti has eyes everywhere." "I know," he said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Running is just buying time. Hiding is a slow death. He'll hunt us relentlessly. It's a matter of pride. He can't have one of his own turn on him and live to tell the tale. So what's the plan?" "Killian, what's the end game? Do we just wait for them to find us?" He turned onto a darker, industrial street, pulling the car into the shadows of a derelict warehouse. He cut the engine, plunging them into near-total darkness, the only light coming from a distant, flickering street lamp. He turned to her, his face half in shadow. "The only way to survive a hunt is to turn the hunter into the hunted," he said, his voice low and intense. "We can't fight Silvio's whole organization. It's an army, but we can make his army fight itself. We create chaos, a war. And in that war, we become ghosts. A war. How this was the moment, the pivot upon which their entire future would turn." He reached into his tactical pack and pulled out a small, slim object, a military-grade encrypted USB drive. He held it between his fingers. "This is the O'Malley confession," he said. "This is the weapon I built to destroy your father. It's also the most valuable piece of information in the city's underworld right now. Moretti wants it to control the senator. But there are other players in this game." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Do you remember the attack? The assassination attempt at the gala?" She nodded, a phantom chill running down her spine. "That wasn't Moretti's crew. That was a rival faction, the Antonelli family. They're younger, more ambitious. And they want Moretti's crown. They don't want to control the senator. They want him dead. He's an obstacle to their expansion. If they had this file," the brutal, elegant simplicity of his plan dawned on her. "If they had proof that my father was vulnerable, that Moretti was about to own him, they'd see it as an act of war." She finished, her mind racing. They'd have to move against Moretti immediately, before he could consolidate that kind of power. Exactly. Killian confirmed. It would ignite a war between the two biggest families in the city. The police would be forced to crack down. Every resource Moretti has would be diverted to fighting the Antonellis and the law. His focus would be off us. It would give us the smokescreen we need to disappear. It was a brilliant, ruthless plan. A king's gambit, sacrificing the most powerful piece on the board to force a catastrophic, game-changing move. But the piece he was talking about sacrificing was her father, her family, her life. "You want to destroy my father to save me," she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. "I want to give you a choice," he countered. And he did something she never expected. He held the USB drive out to her. It lay stark and black against his palm. "This is your life, Seraphina. Your past and your future. The plan doesn't work without it, and I won't use it without you. You were right. I was a coward for hesitating. Now, I'm giving the choice to you. We can try to run, and they will catch us. Or we can light a fire that will burn this whole rotten city to the ground. And maybe, in the chaos, we can walk away. But it means giving this to his enemies. It means your father's secret will be out there. A weapon in the hands of other monsters. There is no clean victory here. There is no going back to the life you had. So you have to decide. Is survival worth that price?" She stared at the small device in his hand. It was the distillation of all his sins, all her pain. It was the bomb that had already blown up her world, just in private. He was asking her to detonate it publicly, to accept that the father she had known was gone, that the life she had lived was a lie, and to use that painful truth as a weapon. She thought of Silvio Moretti's voice, the casual, reptilian cruelty with which he'd threatened to send pieces of her to her father. She looked at Killian, at the man who had betrayed her so completely, yet was now offering her the one thing no one else had agency, the power to choose her own path, however brutal. He was making her a partner in her own salvation. She hated him for what he had done. She hated him for the lies, for the manipulation, for turning her life into this nightmare. But in that moment, she also understood that he was the only person on earth who saw the full, horrifying picture as she did. They were bound together by this ugly truth. Her hand, when she reached out, was steady. Her fingers closed around the cool, smooth metal of the drive. It felt impossibly heavy. "They tried to kill me once," she said, her voice a low, hard whisper she didn't recognize as her own. "The Antonellis. Moretti sent you to keep me alive. The irony is, now you want to use them to do the same thing." "The world is built on irony," he said quietly. She pulled her hand back, clutching the drive. "Okay," she said, the word feeling like a vow. "We burn it all down." A flicker of something relief. Respect. Something more profound passed through Killian's eyes. He had offered her the choice, but he hadn't known what she would do. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Okay." He started the car again. "There's a safe house. It's not much, but it's off the grid. We can operate from there." They drove for another hour, leaving the city behind, heading towards the decaying industrial outskirts. The safe house was the top floor of a disused textile factory, a large dusty loft space with a mattress on the floor, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a high-end, military-grade communication setup in the corner. It was a ghost's home. Killian immediately went to work on the computers. I need to send the file to a specific contact within the Antonelli organization. It has to be encrypted in a way that can't be traced back here. And it has to look like it's coming from a disgruntled source inside Moretti's own camp, to maximize the paranoia. Seraphina watched him, her role in this deadly partnership solidifying. She was not a warrior or a spy, but she was a politician's daughter. She understood leverage, optics, and human nature. "What about the other loose end?" she asked. Killian looked up from his screen. "What other loose end?" "The original threat," she said. "The one that started all of this. The reason my father agreed to a bodyguard in the first place. You said the Antonellis tried to kill me, but the initial threats came from Moretti. Was that all part of the act? Just to get you in the door?" Killian stopped typing. He stared at the screen for a long moment. "Yes," he said. But his voice lacked conviction for the first time. It was the pretext. Something in his hesitation made her press. "You're a good liar." "Killian, I know that better than anyone, but you're a bad one right now. What aren't you telling me?" He finally turned from the computer to face her, his expression deeply troubled. Moretti didn't orchestrate the initial assassination attempt. The Antonellis did. But the initial threats, the ones that made your father panic, I always assumed they were part of Moretti's setup. But the file I got on you, the one that detailed the security situation, it was too perfect, too detailed. It's possible. It's possible someone else wanted your father to hire outside security, someone who knew Moretti would send his best man, someone who wanted me, specifically, in that apartment with you." "What are you saying?" she whispered. "A third player, I'm saying this game might be more complicated than I thought," he said grimly. "But for now, we have to focus on the enemy we know." He turned back to the screen, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He packaged the O'Malley confession, wrapped it in layers of encryption, and wrote a short, anonymous message pointing the finger at Moretti for trying to keep the information to himself. He paused, his finger hovering over the enter key. He looked at Seraphina one last time. It was the final moment before the world changed forever. She met his gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. He pressed enter. The file was sent. The king's gambit had been made. There was no taking it back. They were partners now. Allies forged in betrayal and bound by a desperate bid for survival. They stood in the dusty, silent loft, two fugitives against the world, and waited for the war they had just started to begin. The reckoning was no longer a distant threat. It was coming for them, and they would face it together.